Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I had always prided myself on my ability to remain composed, to stay level-headed no matter the circumstances. After all, I was Dr. Daniel Whitmore, a respected surgeon in Blackthorn, and maintaining control was essential in my profession. But nothing had prepared me for that night. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day. In Blackthorn, the winters were as unforgiving as they came, and that particular evening was no different. The wind howled through the town, carrying a bitter chill that cut through even the thickest of coats. But inside the manor it was warm, too warm, considering how cold I felt when I walked through the door. I arrived home at exactly 9:47 p.m., after a long day at the hospital. The lights in the house were burning, their brightness stark against the encroaching darkness outside. The front door stood wide open, something that struck me as odd since Evelyn had always been a stickler for keeping things secure. I wasn't sure why I didn't immediately investigate. Perhaps I was too exhausted, too eager to put the day behind me. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped inside, sickly sweet, like rotting fruit, mixed with the unmistakable scent of copper. "Evelyn?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The house was eerily quiet. No answer. The master bathroom door was ajar. I approached slowly, my heart racing with an unsettling premonition. I pushed the door open, and what I saw took the breath from my lungs. Evelyn. My Evelyn. She was lying in the clawfoot tub, her porcelain skin mutilated by deep gashes. The water was stained a deep crimson, her blonde hair floating around her head like a macabre halo. Blood streaked the walls as though she had tried to claw her way out of death itself. Her hands were frozen, stretched out to the edges of the tub, fingers still curled as though begging for something or perhaps someone to save her. I screamed, louder than I ever thought possible. The sound echoed through the house, but it felt hollow, as though the walls themselves were mourning. Neighbors came rushing over at the sound of my cries, but when the police arrived, I found myself kneeling in the blood-soaked water, repeating, "I didn't do this." It wasn't the first time I had said those words that night, but it would be the last. The evidence spoke otherwise, and I could do nothing but watch as it all unraveled. I would never forget that night. I would never forget her face, twisted in shock, her mouth forever frozen in a scream that only I could hear. The days after Evelyn's death were nothing short of a nightmare. The police swarmed the house, turning every corner into an interrogation, every breath into suspicion. They asked questions, took notes, collected evidence, but they never stopped staring at me. It was as if I were under a microscope, and every movement, every word I uttered was being analyzed for the faintest sign of guilt. I remember the first few hours after the discovery. I was still in shock, my mind trying to piece together the horror in front of me. I was numb, detached, but I couldn't stop repeating it in my head. I didn't do this. But the facts didn't seem to match my words. There was no forced entry into the house, no signs of a struggle downstairs. The locks had been intact. The wine glasses on the kitchen counter were set in their usual places, one with lipstick stains, the other clean. A casual observer might have thought nothing was out of place. But I knew better. My mind reeled, trying to reconstruct the evening. But it felt like I was walking through fog. They found the letter. A torn love letter in Evelyn's desk, unsigned, filled with passion and promises. It was clear who it was for, someone else. The note ended with a desperate plea. "Meet me tonight, before he finds out." Who was he? Who had she been seeing? The idea of Evelyn betraying me was more than I could bear, yet the evidence was there. Sitting quietly in the corner of her desk, I couldn't think straight. My hands trembled as I looked at it, the reality settling in. Had she really been planning to leave me? Had she already made her decision, and I was just too blind to see it? But it was the phone that truly shook me. Evelyn's phone was found, crushed in the trash compactor. And when they pulled up the deleted voicemail, my blood ran cold. "I won't let you leave me. You won't leave me." "Never," I had snarled. My voice was unmistakable. There was no denying it. I had said it, recorded it, kept it, even after everything. The question lingered in the air. Why had I taken 23 minutes to call 911? Why were my shoes damp as though they had been washed recently? I had no answers. I was caught in the web of my own mistakes, trapped in a story that had been written long before I even understood what was happening. And when the detectives arrived, with their sharp eyes and calculating questions, I could see it in their faces. They knew. They knew what I hadn't even come to terms with yet. I didn't do it. But it didn't matter. The trial was the slow unraveling of everything I had worked my life to build. Every day, I sat in that courtroom, trying to maintain the calm, composed demeanor I had spent years cultivating. But inside, I was unraveling. Evelyn's face was all I could see, and the cruel accusations weighed heavy on my chest. My reputation, my career, my life, all of it was slipping through my fingers. The prosecutor wasted no time. They presented the evidence like a steady drumbeat, each piece more damning than the last. The torn love letter, the voicemail, the wine glasses, the damp shoes. Every tiny detail, every piece of circumstantial evidence painted a picture of guilt. They made me look like a man driven by jealousy, a man who had been betrayed by his wife and decided to take matters into his own hands. But they weren't the only ones. The blood spatter expert was the one who sealed my fate. "The arterial spray," he explained, pointing to the diagram of the bathroom, "indicates the killer stood directly over her, stabbing downward. Again and again." The courtroom was silent as the image flashed across the screen. Evelyn's final moments, her desperate attempts to escape death. It was clear to everyone. There had been no mercy, no hesitation. The killer had stood over her, and the rage had poured out with every thrust. I could barely breathe. My hands were clenched in my lap and my mind raced. I didn't do it. I wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't me. I loved Evelyn. She was everything to me. But as the trial dragged on, I realized how fragile that love had been, how easily it had been broken. The coroner's description of the defensive wounds was worse than anything I could have imagined. Evelyn had fought for her life, her hands slashed and torn, her fingers cut to the bone in a desperate attempt to protect herself. The thought of it, of her pain, tore me apart. I could barely look at the photographs of her mutilated body. But the moment that destroyed me, truly destroyed me, was when the prosecutor held up Evelyn's locket. It was the one I had given her. I had always been proud of it. But now, as the prosecutor snapped it open, revealing a photo of another man inside, I felt my world collapse. The look in the jury's eyes told me everything. They didn't care about my truth. They only cared about the evidence. That was the moment it became clear. The world had already judged me. There was no going back. The verdict came swiftly. The jury, after what felt like an eternity of deliberation, had found me guilty. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The weight of those words settled on my chest like a stone, crushing the last breath of hope I had left. I was led out of the courtroom, my hands shackled, my legs unsteady beneath me. As I passed by the rows of spectators, I could hear the faint whispers. Some of pity, most of disgust. They had made up their minds. They had seen the evidence. They had heard my voice on the voicemail. They had seen the blood. But none of them knew the truth. In prison, life was a slow and brutal adjustment. The days blurred together in a haze of isolation and regret. I was no longer Dr. Daniel Whitmore, respected surgeon. I was just another inmate, another face in the sea of men who had done things they regretted. I kept my head down, staying out of the way, trying to hold on to the remnants of my dignity. But every day felt like a reminder of how far I had fallen. Cell was small, just enough room for the bare essentials. The walls were cold and the air always felt stale. I couldn't escape the silence that pressed in on me at night when I was alone with my thoughts, and the shadows. The shadows were the worst part. At night, I could hear them moving, shuffling along the edges of my cell, whispering my name in voices that sounded too familiar. Evelyn's voice. I didn't do it, Evelyn. I swear. I would whisper back into the darkness, the words escaping my lips before I could stop them. It was during those long, lonely nights that I began to hear it. A wet, gurgling laugh echoing from the shadows. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But as the days went on, the laughter grew louder, more distinct. It was unmistakable now. The laugh of someone who had known my every secret, my every fear. It was Evelyn's laugh. She was here. She was with me. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation, the madness creeping in after months of silence. But deep down, I knew what it was. Evelyn was in the darkness with me, and she wasn't ready to let me forget. The truth had been buried beneath the weight of the lies. And now it seemed the truth was haunting me from the shadows. I didn't kill her. I couldn't have. But in this prison, surrounded by my guilt and the echoing laughter of her ghost, it felt like I had. I had been in prison for 3 years when the anniversary of Evelyn's death came around again. The guards had always known the date, of course. They could see it on the calendar just like I could. But it wasn't just any date for me. It wasn't just another day. It was the day I would never escape from. The day the blood still stained my hands and my mind. The day the truth would never set me free. That night, I could feel the cold creeping in faster than usual. The air in my cell seemed to thicken. The walls closing in on me in a way I could never escape. The silence that had always haunted me seemed louder tonight, sharper, as if it could swallow me whole. I lay in my bunk staring up at the cracked ceiling, trying not to think about her, trying not to remember how it had all happened, how it had gone so wrong. But it was impossible. I heard the laughter again, that gurgling sound, muffled and distant, at first like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. Then it grew louder, clearer, until it was right next to my ear. I flinched sitting up in my bed, my heart racing in my chest. There was no one there, not physically, I knew that. But it felt like something, was standing right over me, watching me. Evelyn, I whispered into the darkness. The words escaped before I could stop them. Evelyn, please, I didn't do it, I swear. But the shadows in my cell seemed to thicken, and the laughter only grew louder, more mocking. It wasn't just the voice of a woman anymore. It was a chorus of voices, all laughing at me. I couldn't escape it. No matter how tightly I shut my eyes, no matter how hard I tried to block out the sound, it kept coming, echoing in my mind, in my bones. I didn't do it, I said again, louder this time. I didn't kill her. I loved her. I swear to God, I loved her. The laughter stopped, and for a moment the silence was unbearable. I thought just for a second that maybe, just maybe, it was all in my head. That maybe I was losing my mind, that I could finally be at peace with myself. But then I heard it. A voice, soft and almost kind, just behind me. You didn't love me, Daniel, it whispered, the words sending a chill down my spine. If you had loved me, you wouldn't have done what you did. I froze, the blood draining from my face. That voice, so familiar, so tender. It was Evelyn. Turned, my pulse pounding in my ears, but there was no one there. Just the darkness, just the cell. And yet I felt her presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. I closed my eyes, shaking my head, trying to block out the vision of her face, her wide, terrified eyes staring at me from that night. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop the truth that I had buried so deep inside me from finally breaking free. I did it. I killed her. I had loved her, yes, but I was selfish. I was consumed by my own jealousy, my fear of losing her, my need to possess her. I had been so blinded by my own pride that I didn't see her pain, her desperation. I didn't see the way she had been trying to leave me. I didn't see the way she had tried to escape, and in the end, I had been the one to drag her down, to trap her in a life she didn't want. I had killed Evelyn, and now, she was here, in the shadows with me, reminding me of it every day. Every moment I spent in this prison, I was haunted by her, by my own guilt, by the truth I had tried to bury. But she wouldn't let me forget. "I didn't do it, Evelyn," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. "I didn't do it. I swear." From the darkness, the laugh echoed again, wet and gurgling, full of malice. And this time it was no longer just the voice of the woman I had loved. It was the voice of death itself. And as I lay in my cot, listening to the laughter that would never stop, I knew deep in my soul that Evelyn would never let me go. She would haunt me forever, and I would never escape the prison of my own guilt. It was the cold that woke me. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and tightens your chest until breathing feels like a labor. But it wasn't just the weather. Something was off in Blackwater Hollow that night. Something thick in the air, almost as if the very world had shifted just enough to make every movement feel wrong. I was already restless by the time the scream tore through the hollow. At first I thought it was a wind gust or some animal caught in a trap. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was human. A woman's scream, high-pitched, desperate, and so guttural it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I hadn't been asleep for long. I looked at the clock beside my bed, 4:23 a.m. The time stuck with me because it seemed impossible. In a town like Blackwater Hollow, nothing ever happened at that hour. The quiet was too heavy, too suffocating. The scream sounded distant, like it had come from the old Voss estate at the far end of Hemlock Lane. The wind had a way of carrying sounds across the frozen river, amplifying them until they sounded like whispers in your ear. But even so, it felt wrong. There was something about the sound that felt deliberate. I threw off the covers, already pulling on my boots before I realized I was doing it. It wasn't like I had to go to the scene. I was the sheriff, after all, and I had a responsibility. But something deep in my gut told me I needed to see it for myself. You couldn't live in a place like Blackwater Hollow and ignore the instinct to follow a trail of darkness. The snow was fresh that night, thick and undisturbed. I made my way across the yard, the air biting at my skin. The path to the Voss estate was treacherous, the kind of place where you could easily lose your footing if you weren't careful. I had a feeling no one else had heard the scream yet. At least, no one who would get out of bed to do something about it. It was the dead of winter, and the people of Blackwater Hollow didn't meddle in things that didn't concern them. The Voss house loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the snow-drenched landscape. The place had always looked abandoned to me, even when Eleanor lived there. The house was one of those relics of a past too ugly to remember, a monument to someone who never made peace with whatever demons had plagued them. Eleanor Voss had never been a happy woman. No one ever spoke ill of her, at least not openly. But everyone knew there were secrets buried behind those walls. When I reached the front gate, the silence of the night seemed to deepen. The house was still. No lights, no movement. Nothing. At all. Save for the faint whisper of the wind and the scrape of snow beneath my boots. I hesitated before walking up the creaking steps and pushing open the door. It wasn't locked. That didn't surprise me. Eleanor had never been one to lock herself in. The moment I crossed the threshold, something in the air changed. It wasn't just the smell. Kerosene mixed with something fouler, something rotten that clung to my nose and made my stomach churn. It was the atmosphere, the oppressive weight that seemed to settle on my chest, as if the house was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I called out, my voice reverberating in the emptiness. "Eleanor?" Nothing. No answer. I moved cautiously through the hall, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The house was massive, sprawling, decaying, but beautiful in a way. The grand staircase stood before me, a dark monument to something lost long ago. As I ascended, the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each step echoing like a reminder of how alone I was in this vast, cold space. At the top of the stairs, I turned toward the parlor, where the light from a single bulb flickered dimly. That was where I found her. Eleanor Voss was lying at the foot of the staircase, her body arranged in a grotesque parody of repose. Her arms were folded neatly over her chest, her fingers wrapped around a single black rose, its petals wilted and dry. Her throat had been slit ear to ear, the wound so deep it had practically severed her head from her body. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and thick like ink. Yet there was something strangely serene about the way her body was positioned, an eerie, almost peaceful quality to it. Her face was pale, almost gray, as though the life had been drained from her. But there was no mistaking the horror of it all. The sight of her body so carefully posed made my gut twist. The scent of kerosene was strong here, like a sickly, sweet perfume. I didn't need to see more to know something terrible had happened. Crouched down beside her, carefully avoiding the blood that had already frozen in place. There was no sign of struggle, nothing that indicated she had fought her attacker. But the one detail that caught my attention, the one thing that would stay with me, was the rose. It didn't belong. It was out of place. I'd seen roses before, of course, but this one, with its blackened petals and the strange feeling it gave me, was unlike anything I'd ever seen. This wasn't some simple act of violence. This wasn't just a murder. It was a message. I pulled out my radio, calling for backup, but I knew it was already too late. Whatever had happened here, whatever twisted mind had left that rose in Eleanor's grasp, it was already gone. And I was left with a puzzle that only grew darker the more I looked at it. As I stood up, I felt the weight of the silence press in on me again. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch further, as if they had lives of their own. Something was watching me. Something had been here, and I knew that I wasn't alone in this house. The snow continued to fall soft and steady as I waited for backup. It wasn't just the body that haunted me in that cold, decaying house. It was the overwhelming sense that something more had occurred here, something beyond murder. Eleanor's death was horrific, yes, but it felt ritualistic, methodical. And the black rose, that detail gnawed at me. I could almost feel its dark weight hanging in the air like a grim reminder. I hadn't even thought to check for a weapon when I first found Eleanor. My mind was racing with questions that didn't have answers, so I kept my focus on what was in front of me. The scene. The black rose was the first anomaly, but I soon realized there were others. Her hands, folded so carefully, almost tenderly, over her chest, told me that her attacker had taken their time. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment act. Whoever had done this had planned it. But I couldn't just stand, there lost in the horror of it. The sheriff's office would arrive soon, and I needed answers. As I paced back into the hall, I found myself drawn to a small study room off the parlor. A fire had been set there, but it was long since burned out, the hearth now nothing more than charred remnants. The room was dim, barely lit by the dying embers, and yet I could see the floorboards were disturbed, not in the usual way, but as though something had been moved with deliberate care. There, in the far corner of the room, was a floorboard that didn't seem quite right. The edges were cracked, but the wood itself appeared newer than the rest of the room. I knelt beside it and carefully pried it loose, using the fire poker I'd grabbed earlier. Beneath the floorboard was a small, leather-bound ledger, its corners worn from age and handling. The kind of book you'd expect to find in a house that had been untouched for years, hidden away like some forgotten secret. I flipped the cover open, but the first few pages were nothing more than notes and dates, nothing remarkable. But then, I reached the back pages. That's when things got strange. The handwriting was spidery, jagged. Eleanor's, I assumed, but it was hard to tell. Some of the words were slanted in odd ways, as if she'd been in a hurry to get them out, or Maybe she was trying to escape something. I didn't know, but the further I read, the darker the words became. It was a journal of sorts, but the entries weren't about her day-to-day life. They were about someone else, a man who Eleanor referred to only as the artist or sometimes the shadow. There was a sense of dread in the way Eleanor wrote about him. It wasn't an ordinary obsession. It was an invasion of her thoughts, an all-consuming presence. The man seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, but it was clear he'd been coming to her for some time. Her words became more frantic the further back I read, almost as if she were pleading with whoever was reading the journal to understand the horror of what she was experiencing. One of the entries stood out. He says I'll be his masterpiece. He brings the roses with him, the black ones. They're always waiting for me when I wake. I can't escape him. I don't know if I want to anymore, but I'm afraid of what he'll make me do. The entry was dated a few days before her death. Her words were barely legible, smeared with what I could only assume was ink, or perhaps something else, something darker. But the final line sent a chill down my spine. I think he's already made me part of his work. I feel myself slipping, away, fading. I wonder if he's already taken my face. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The words didn't make sense, not fully. What did she mean by slipping away? Who was this artist? And why had Eleanor mentioned that he had taken her face? I snapped the ledger shut. I couldn't afford to linger over it any longer. The shadows in this house were heavy, and the silence had grown deafening. As I stood up and shoved the ledger into my coat pocket, a thought hit me. What if the black rose wasn't just a symbol of death? What if it had a meaning Eleanor hadn't understood? Or maybe the real meaning was something she couldn't escape no matter how much she tried. I was jolted from my thoughts by the sound of footsteps, sharp and distinct, echoing from the front door. Backup had arrived. I could already see their flashlights cutting through the darkness outside the windows. I moved to the back of the house to meet them, keeping my hand tight around the ledger in my pocket. There were too many questions and too few answers. The team spread out quickly, their boots crunching on the frozen floor as they entered. I gave them a quick briefing, but I was careful to leave out the journal. For now, it was just a hunch, one that I couldn't explain to anyone else. Sheriff Callahan arrived last, his long coat swaying as he walked through the door, his eyes scanning the room with practiced detachment. He was a man who had seen everything, but even his face betrayed something akin to disbelief when he saw Eleanor's body. He made a low sound in his throat, part sigh, part growl, and moved toward her, kneeling down for a closer inspection. His eyes caught mine, narrowed with a mixture of suspicion and something else I couldn't quite place. Find anything? I hesitated. There was a certain pressure in his question, a need to keep control. But something in me knew the truth. This wasn't just another murder to solve. This was something more. Yeah, I said, my voice low, barely above a whisper. There's something in the walls, a message, a warning. Callahan's gaze sharpened. What kind of warning? I swallowed hard, looking down at Eleanor's lifeless form. The truth was too ugly to admit just yet. But deep down I knew I was already too far into this to back out. The kind you can't ignore, I said quietly. And I think it's still out there. The morning after the discovery of Eleanor Voss's body, the town was abuzz with rumors, whispers, and a palpable sense of dread that clung to the air like the thick fog rolling down from Blackwater Mountain. The entire community of Blackwater Hollow was unsettled, and even those who hadn't seen Eleanor in years found themselves drawn into the web of gossip surrounding her death. It was impossible not to speculate. How could something so grotesque happen in a quiet town like this? And who was responsible? By the time the police had finished securing the scene and processing evidence, my mind was still reeling from what I had uncovered in Eleanor's ledger. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't add up. Eleanor had spoken about someone, the artist, but who was he? And why had she been so terrified of him? I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was missing something important. My first stop that morning was at the Voss family farm where Eleanor had grown up. The place was as desolate as I had imagined, the farmhouse sagging under years of neglect. The snow had piled high along the edges of the field, and a thin layer of frost covered the windows. It looked like no one had tended to it in months, maybe even years. There was something chilling about the house, something that reminded me of the coldness I'd felt when I first entered Eleanor's home. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting under the pressure. Inside, I found a small group gathered, mostly family, a few of the older townsfolk, and a couple of neighbors who had known Eleanor from when she was young. I had to blink a few times to adjust my eyes to the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. The room was filled with murmurs, all of them glancing toward me with a mixture of unease and suspicion. Sheriff Callahan's already been by. Hasn't he? I asked, trying to project calm. A few heads nodded, but the rest of them stayed silent, their eyes darting away from mine. Anything strange happened before the murder? Anything unusual? Anything out of place? I pressed, walking further into the room. The questions seemed to stir something in the crowd, and a few voices started to rise. An elderly woman, her hair a cloud of white around her face, spoke first, her voice thick with a southern drawl. I saw her the day before it happened. Eleanor, I mean. She was walking through the cemetery with that artist fellow. You know, the one who's been visiting her for weeks. He was standing near the headstones, looking all pale and strange-like. Didn't look like he belonged anywhere, not even in this world, if you know what I mean. I felt my stomach tighten at the mention of the artist. It was the first concrete sighting of him I'd gotten, but it only raised more questions. The woman continued, her eyes wide as she recounted what she'd seen. I saw 'em both walking away from the graveyard. She looked like she was walking with a ghost. I don't know if she was scared or what, but something wasn't right. I jotted down her words in my notebook, nodding as I processed the information. A pale man, an artist, who was seen in the cemetery with Eleanor the day before she died. It was the first lead that felt like it could go somewhere. I turned to the next witness, an older man named Jacob Harker, who had lived in Blackwater Hollow for nearly as long as the mill had been abandoned. He'd been part of the first responders to Eleanor's house, and I knew him to be a man who never took his eyes off anything. His gaze was steady, sharp, always calculating. I saw him too, Jacob said, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. Not just the artist, but her ex-husband, Silas. That was the night before. I saw him lurking around the house, drunk as a skunk, kicking at the gate. He was yelling something, couldn't hear what, but I could tell he wasn't in his right mind. My pen froze on the paper. Silas Voss. Eleanor's ex-husband had been spotted outside her home the night before her death, looking drunk and angry. But had he been responsible for what had happened to her? That ain't all, Jacob continued, his eyes narrowing as if reliving the moment. I swear I saw someone else in the window after Silas left. A tall figure, too tall. I thought maybe it was just the wine, but I saw him clearly. There was no face, just darkness. Then the lights went out. A chill ran down my spine, a faceless figure lingering in the window. The artist, I thought. But could he have been the same person Jacob had seen? Was the tall figure the same man who had haunted Eleanor's diary? The pieces were starting to fit together, but I wasn't sure what the picture was shaping into. What do you mean, no face? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Could it have been someone else? Jacob shook his head. I don't know. It was like the shadow of a person. It didn't have a proper face, just void. A black hole, if that makes sense. It made perfect sense to me, but I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The conversation shifted to another witness, Sarah Jenkins, the widow who lived a few streets over. Sarah had lived in Blackwater Hollow for over 50 years and knew the town's people as well as she knew her own children. If there was anyone who could provide insight into the unusual happenings of the past weeks, it was her. I saw him too, Sarah said, looking at me over the rim of her glasses. The artist. He came by the house a week ago, right around sunset. He was sitting by the fence, sketching the house. I didn't think much of it at the time, but he looked odd, like he was more drawn to the house than the scenery around him. And I swear he had the strangest hands, long bony fingers. He looked like he was made to draw, if you know what I mean. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to take shape in my mind. but I still couldn't put them all together. The artist, he'd been seen with Eleanor sketching her house, his hands long and strange, his face absent. But why had he been so obsessed with her? And was he the same person who had appeared in the shadows of her home? "Did you see the man again?" I asked Sarah, leaning in. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "But I have a feeling he'll be back." The way he looked at me, I knew I wasn't supposed to be there seeing him. The room fell silent at Sarah's words, the weight of them settling like a stone. It was clear that something far darker was at play here, something that none of us could fully understand. "I'm afraid this isn't over," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. The witnesses had provided some answers, but they also raised more questions. I left the Voss house feeling more unsettled than I'd ever been. There was something in the air around Blackwater Hollow that felt wrong, and as I walked out into the snow, the darkened river at my back, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's death was only the beginning. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling more oppressive than the last. Blackwater Hollow had a way of clinging to your bones, a quiet sort of dread that crept up when you least expected it. As I stood outside the Voss estate, the snow swirling around me in biting gusts of wind, I couldn't shake the thought that something darker, far more sinister, was unfolding right under my nose. It wasn't just the whispers of the townspeople or the odd, fragmented details of what they'd seen. It was Eleanor's ledger. Eleanor Voss had been a private woman, especially in her final years. She hadn't talked much about her past, at least not to anyone who was still alive. But her diary, hidden under the floorboards of her bedroom, had painted a far more terrifying picture than anyone in Blackwater Hollow could have imagined. The fact that I had found it, hidden in the dark corners of a crumbling mansion, felt like a sign. Like the answers were there, waiting for me to pull them out, no matter the cost. The details in Eleanor's journal had haunted me all day. They had been disturbing enough on their own, but one entry in particular stuck with me. "He says I'll be his masterpiece." The artist had been in her life for months, maybe longer, and she was terrified of him. Whoever this man was, this artist, he wasn't just some troubled soul or eccentric painter. He was something darker, something that used her fear as fuel. And as I sat there in the small, dimly lit office at the sheriff's station, Eleanor's words felt more like a warning than a confession. But to whom? What was he creating with her? And why had he used the word masterpiece? I leaned back in, the creaky chair rubbing my temples as I replayed everything in my mind. I'd spent the better part of the day tracking down every possible lead, from Silas Voss to the milkman to the strange man in the cemetery. But it was the ledger that felt like the most important clue. I had it open in front of me now, the thin paper crackling under my fingers as I scanned the pages again. The writing was frantic, the ink smudged in places. Eleanor had been spiraling, terrified of something or someone. She mentioned strange encounters, late-night visits, a presence in the house that never left her. But the most chilling entry was from the night before she died. "He came again tonight, the artist. His fingers, they move too fast. He tells me to hold still, but I can't. I feel him watching me even when I close my eyes. His work is taking shape. I am becoming part of it." The words left a cold knot in my stomach. Was she talking about the man who had been seen lurking around her property? Sketching? The one with the long fingers who was obsessed with her house? What was he creating? I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to find him. But I knew, deep down, I was already too late. By the time I returned to the Voss estate, the town had begun to settle into the quiet routine it always fell into after a tragedy. The streets were empty, the houses dark. It was as if the whole town had drawn its curtains against the night, sealing itself away from the terrible things unfolding just beneath the surface. I drove up Hemlock Lane slowly, the tires crunching, on the snow as I pulled up to the old house. The windows were dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The house loomed ahead, its shadow stretching across the yard. There was something alive about it. The creaking of the shutters, The wind howling through the empty halls, the strange, unsettling feeling that seemed to radiate from the place. I parked outside and got out of the car, shivering despite my coat. The temperature had dropped significantly since morning, and my breath clouded in front of me. As I made my way up the path, the door of the Voss house creaked open, and a figure stepped out from behind the door. I froze. It was Silas Voss. His face was gaunt, hollowed by stress and alcohol, and his clothes were rumpled, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were wild, bloodshot from lack of sleep, and he was clutching a small, leather-bound notebook in his hands. The sight of him made my pulse race. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice barely rising above a whisper. I don't know anymore," he muttered, his voice strained. "It's all twisted up. Everything. I tried to get her back, you know. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Get her back?" I repeated, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm trying to make sense of it," Silas said, his eyes darting nervously. "I'm trying to understand what's happening, what he was doing. Eleanor, she said she was helping him, but she was scared too. She said something about being part of it, part of his work." The mention of work caught my attention, and I stepped closer, narrowing my eyes. "What do you mean, part of his work?" I asked. Silas's voice dropped to a whisper, his words shaking. "She was becoming his masterpiece, just like he told her. I think she thought she was helping him. She thought it was art, but it wasn't. It was something else. Something terrible." I took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling over me like a fog. The pieces were coming together, but they didn't fit, and I wasn't sure if I wanted them to. Silas looked down at the notebook he was clutching, his hands trembling. "I've been going through her things, and I found something." He handed me the notebook. It was a sketchbook, ragged, its pages worn down from frequent use. Inside, the first few pages were filled with lifelike drawings of Eleanor, done in exquisite detail. But as I turned the pages, something shifted. The faces of the drawings began to distort, warped, grotesque representations of Eleanor, with strange, elongated limbs, distorted features, and shadows that seemed to move. The last page was different. It was a drawing of a woman, Eleanor, or what used to be Eleanor, but her face had been replaced by a black rose. The petals curled around her features like a mask, suffocating everything beneath it. At the bottom of the page, in a shaky, smudged handwriting, it read, "She will be my masterpiece. Her soul will live on in the canvas." My heart stopped. The artist had been creating more than a portrait. He had been taking Eleanor piece by piece and turning her into something else, something far more horrifying than I had imagined. I stared at the page for a long time, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. "What is this?" I whispered, my throat tight. Silas's eyes were wide with fear. "It's him. It's Lucien Duval. He's the one who did this to her. He's the one who what?" I asked, barely able to breathe. But Silas didn't answer. He was staring at the house, his face a mask of terror, and I followed his gaze. From the top of the staircase, a shadowy figure watched us, unmoving. Lucien Duval, and his eyes, those hollow, black eyes, were locked on me. The shadow standing at the top of the staircase didn't move, but it was enough to freeze me in place. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart seemed to slow, each beat more hesitant than the last. I should have run, I knew that. I should have turned on my heel and fled into the night, away from the Voss estate and away from whatever nightmare Lucien Duval had become. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure that stood like a ghost. Its presence, more unnerving than anything I had ever faced. "Lucien," I whispered, barely able to breathe. The figure didn't respond. But then, as though he'd heard me, he moved, slowly, deliberately, and descended the stairs, his face still hidden beneath the shadows of the hooded cloak he wore. Each step was soundless, and yet the air felt thick with tension, as if the Very house was holding its breath. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice breaking through the oppressive silence. "What have you done to Eleanor? What have you turned her into?" Lucian didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, delicate object. My eyes strained to make it out in the dim light, but I recognized it immediately, a black rose. A single dark bloom, its petals unfurling like a twisted crown. "You're too late," Lucian said, his voice like a rasping whisper. "She's already a part of me. I told her she'd be my masterpiece, and now she is." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew exactly what he meant. The sketches, the drawings, the grotesque distortions of Eleanor's likeness. He hadn't just painted her, he'd taken her. Piece by piece, he'd twisted her into something else. And now whatever was left of Eleanor Voss wasn't just a woman. She was part of his sick, macabre collection. "No," I said, the word barely more than a breath. "No, you didn't." But he was already moving closer, his figure emerging from the shadows like a specter. His face, when he finally stepped into the dim light of the foyer, was exactly what I feared. Hollow, gaunt, and covered in thin, almost translucent skin, as if it were stretched too tightly over his skull. His eyes, dark and endless, seemed to swallow the light itself, and when they met mine, I felt like I was sinking into the depths of some terrible abyss. "You think you can stop me?" Lucian's voice was a low, mocking growl. "You think you can undo what I've done?" She was perfect for me, a living piece of art. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat, but I forced it down. I couldn't let fear control me. Not now. I had to stop him. "You're a monster," I spat, stepping forward. "Eleanor was a person, not your canvas. You didn't create art. You butchered her." Lucian didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed to smile, a grotesque, stretched grin that made my skin crawl. "Art is subjective, Sheriff. You wouldn't understand. But you will. Soon enough." Before I could react, he threw the black rose onto the floor at my feet. I jumped back, my pulse quickening. The petals unfurled with an almost unnatural grace, their edges curling like they were alive, and a sickly, sweet scent filled the air, something foul mixed with the tang of old death. "Eleanor wanted to be free of me," Lucian continued, his voice gaining strength, a manic edge creeping into his tone. "She didn't understand, though. No one does. But you will, Sheriff. You'll see what true beauty is. You'll become part of my masterpiece, just like she did." The floor beneath me creaked, and I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. There was no way out. No escape from the twisted nightmare Lucian had created. And yet, I couldn't let it end like this. Not with him winning. Not with Eleanor becoming another ghost, another piece in his sick collection. I needed to stop him, and I needed to do it fast. The fire poker, the baseball bat. I looked around the foyer, searching for anything I could use, but it was too late. Lucian had already closed the gap between us, his long, cold fingers reaching out like claws. I lunged forward, using every ounce of adrenaline left in my body. My hand wrapped around the fire poker, and I swung it at him with all my strength. He dodged it easily, a twisted smile curling on his lips as he backed away, his movements unnaturally smooth. "You can't stop me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You will become part of the art." But something in his voice faltered, just for a moment as his gaze flicked to the shadows behind me. For the briefest instant I saw something flicker, something that wasn't him, something that wasn't part of his twisted vision, a memory, a shadow of who he used to be. It was enough. I seized the moment, grabbing the poker again and slamming it toward him. This time, it caught him, right across the chest. His body crumpled backward, but he didn't fall. Instead, he reached up, clawing at his own chest, as if the wound had pierced deeper than flesh. His eyes widened in shock, then twisted with a horrifying blend of rage and fear. "You ruined it," he hissed. You can't destroy what's already been created. But it was too late. The house seemed to groan, as if it were alive, as if Lucian's presence had finally broken something inside it. He fell to the ground, his breath rattling in his throat, and the black rose at my feet flickered and died, its petals turning to dust. Lucian Duval was gone. It wasn't over, though. The town of Blackwater Hollow would never forget the horrors that had unfolded within the Voss estate. In the days that followed, I watched as they burned the house to the ground, its charred remains sinking into the snow like some kind of burial pyre for the darkness that had taken root there. But the whispers didn't stop. They never did. The black roses, the eerie sketches, the strange, lingering sensation that something still watched from the shadows. These things would haunt Blackwater Hollow for years to come. And sometimes, when the snow fell heavy, and the wind howled through the trees, I thought I could still hear the soft, sickly rustle of a black rose, whispering. The masterpiece wasn't finished. Not yet. I'm the kind of person who doesn't believe in ghosts. I'm not even all that interested in the paranormal anymore. But there's something about me that makes people think I am. Maybe it's because I spent a year traveling through the most haunted places in the country, camera in hand, searching for something that would make me believe. I never found it, but people still tell me I'm the type who would see something. My abuela, though, she would have said I was asking for it. She always warned me, told me stories about the things that lurk in the woods, things we can't see, only feel. She wasn't a superstitious woman, not in the way some of the elders in our family were. But she had her moments. And there was one warning that stuck with me. When the smoke curls backward, mija, you run. It was a warning she gave me. Every time I'd leave for another one of my photo shoots in the wilderness, always as I kissed her goodbye. Run, she'd say, like she knew something I didn't. But I'd always just smile, nod, and tell her I'd be fine, because, well, I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Not anymore. That day in early November, my two best friends and I were heading to a remote cabin in the Black Pines wilderness, just north of Seattle, for what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend away from city life. Jake, the skeptic, drove, as usual, and Mira, the true crime junkie, sat in the passenger seat with her phone, already working on a new podcast episode. I was in the back, staring out the window, taking pictures of the fog-heavy trees, a perfect moment to get some eerie shots, the kind that people love, but not too much, just enough to make them wonder. The drive had been fine at first. We'd been listening to some old rock music, laughing about nonsense, the air thick with that crisp autumn scent. But then, our GPS started to glitch. The screen flickered and a message popped up. Recalculating route. Jake cursed under his breath. Great, another detour. Where are we even now? I glanced at the screen. Instead of the usual route to the cabin, we were being rerouted to a road called Old Ash Road. It wasn't on any map, I knew. Not a good sign, but I shrugged it off. The woods are thick around here, and it wasn't unusual for roads to shift, or get renamed. Maybe it's a shortcut, I suggested, trying to keep the mood light. Jake didn't respond at first, just muttered a half-hearted, "I doubt it," and kept driving, his eyes flicking between the road and the GPS screen. Mira, who hadn't been paying attention, looked up from her phone. Old Ash Road, is that even a thing? I don't think I've heard of it. I turned to look out the window again, the fog starting to thicken, curling around the trees like a living thing. There was something unsettling about the way it moved, like it was watching us. But I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what to make of it. The fog pressed in, dense and suffocating. The trees grew closer together and the road narrowed. The air in the car grew thicker too, like it was harder to breathe, and I cracked the window slightly. The cold hit me immediately, and my breath fogged the glass. But it didn't matter. The air was still heavy, thick with moisture. Then something strange happened. Jake lit a cigarette, the faint glow from the tip illuminating his face for a moment. But as he took a drag, something was wrong. The smoke didn't rise as it should have. Instead, it twisted in on itself, coiling in tight spirals. Then, like a shape coming into focus, the smoke formed a skeletal hand, reaching toward the ceiling before it dissipated into the air, vanishing without a trace. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, flicking the cigarette out the window. Mira turned, in her seat eyeing him curiously. "What is it?" Jake didn't look at her. "The smoke. It did something weird." He shook his head like he was trying to dismiss it, but I could tell it unsettled him. I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Weird. How?" "It twisted," Jake said, his voice low, his tone bordering on unease, like a hand. Like something was trying to pull itself together. I don't know. It was just wrong. I stared out the window, trying to shake off the odd feeling creeping into my spine. The fog outside was even thicker now. In fact, I couldn't even see the road in front of us anymore, just the pale, eerie blur of white and gray swirling in the trees. Suddenly, with no warning, the car sputtered, then died. The engine went quiet and the headlights flickered once, then went dark. "Are you kidding me?" Jake said, his voice rising in frustration. "We're in the middle of nowhere and the car dies?" He tried the ignition again, but there was nothing. Just the click of the engine not even turning over. "Let's just get out and walk," Mira suggested, her voice unbothered, though I could see her fidgeting nervously. She always sounded calm when things got weird, but I could tell she was starting to feel it too. "There's got to be a road somewhere." I was about to speak up, but that's when I noticed it. The fog outside the window didn't move like it should have. It curled back, retreating like a living thing. My heart skipped a beat. I felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to bolt, to run in the opposite direction. But instead of saying anything, I just stayed silent, watching as the fog stretched its fingers around the car. There was something deeply wrong here. And it wasn't the engine, it wasn't the road, or even the GPS. It was something about the way the fog was moving, like it had a mind of its own. I remembered my abuela's words. "When the smoke curls, backward, Mija, you run." But I didn't. Not yet. I should have. The car sat there, dead in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a wall of fog so thick it felt like we were trapped in a snow globe. Everything distant, muffled, and unnervingly still. It was like time had slowed down, or maybe it had stopped altogether. Jake slammed his fist against the steering wheel. "I swear, if this is some kind of prank, Jake, stop." Mira's voice cut through the growing tension. Her eyes were wide, scanning the empty road through the fog. "You know as well as I do this isn't a joke." She was the first to speak, but I could feel the unease thickening in the air. The weight of the silence pressed down on us, the kind that makes your skin feel too tight, like you're being watched even though you can't see anything. "Let's just get out and check the engine," I said, my voice shaking slightly more than I intended. But I couldn't stay in that car. I couldn't stay in the stillness. Something wasn't right, and it had nothing to do with the damn car or the fog. It was the air, the weight of it, the way it pressed in on us, thick and suffocating. Jake cursed again under his breath and jerked the door open. He stepped out first and Mira and I followed, the cold immediately biting into my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help much. The fog was so thick I could barely see the outline of the car, let alone the trees around us. "I don't get it," Jake muttered as he popped the hood and leaned over it, his hands moving over the engine as if trying to will it back to life. "Everything's fine here. No reason it should have stalled like that." I stood by the passenger side of the car, my hands stuffed deep into my pockets, looking around. The fog was getting thicker, swirling around like a living thing. The silence felt unnatural, like the world had pressed pause. There were no birds, no wind, no sounds of wildlife. It was the kind of stillness that made your skin crawl. Then it happened. I couldn't explain it. One minute Jake was fiddling with the engine, his back to me, and the next, there it was. The smoke. I don't know how to describe it, not in a way that makes sense. It wasn't like regular smoke, not like what you'd see coming from a fire. It twisted in the air in tight spirals, but it didn't rise. It didn't go up like smoke should. Instead, it curled backward, almost as if it was pulling itself into a shape, a form that didn't belong. It moved faster now, wrapping itself around Jake's feet like it was trying to grab hold of him. He stepped back, his boots scraping against the gravel, eyes wide, and for a split second I swear I saw his mouth twitch in something like fear. Then, the smoke took shape. The fog swirled around him, creating something else. A shadow, a dark silhouette that didn't belong in the world of the living. I couldn't make out details, but I could see the way the smoke bent, twisted, and formed a shape far too tall, too long to be human. "Jake," I called, my voice sharp and panicked. "Get back in the car." But he didn't hear me. Or if he did, he didn't respond. The smoke was moving too fast now, latching onto him, covering his body in a veil. I tried to step forward, to grab his arm, to pull him away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the air had thickened around me, like I was wading through concrete. Mira had started walking toward him, her expression more confused than scared. "Jake?" she called. "What the hell is that?" Her voice was strained, like she couldn't understand what she was seeing. And I couldn't either. In an instant, the smoke changed direction. It started to move upward, spreading around Jake, like a cloud, and then it started to wrap itself around his body, his arms, his legs, his head, pulling him toward the fog that seemed to swallow him whole. His body jerked, limbs moving at odd angles as if his joints had become unhinged. His face twisted in pain, or maybe it was fear. I couldn't tell. But the worst part, his body wasn't moving like it should have. It wasn't like he was running or stumbling. It was like his body was no longer under his control, like the smoke itself was guiding him, bending his shape into something unnatural. And then, as quickly as it had come, the smoke lifted. Jake's body collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud. His limbs twisted at impossible angles, his skin, no, his flesh, starting to peel away like melting wax. And his eyes, his wide, terrified eyes, those weren't his eyes anymore. The smoke had taken them, and what was left in their place was something black, something empty. "Jake," Mira screamed, rushing toward him, but I grabbed her arm before she could take another step. "No," I whispered, pulling her back, my voice trembling. "We can't help him. Not like this." But she wasn't listening. She was fighting me now, trying to break free, her eyes filled with desperation, and then she stopped, her entire body freezing as if she had seen something worse than what we had already witnessed. I followed her gaze. There, beyond the now silent form of Jake, was the fog. It was moving again, but this time, it was not alone. There were figures within it, shifting shapes that weren't human, weren't anything that could belong in this world. The fog parted slightly, and through the veil I saw them, the burned ones. They were bodies, or what was left of them, made entirely of smoke. Their limbs twisted and snapped, like they weren't human at all. Their faces, if they even had faces, hidden in shadow. They moved toward us, their forms dissipating and reassembling like they were constantly falling apart, only to reassemble into something more horrifying. "Lena," Mira gasped, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here now." But my body was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't even think. The smoke was too close, too real. I felt a coldness crawling up my spine, a deep primal terror that clawed at my chest. And then the voice came. The radio crackled to life, loud and sudden, cutting through the silence. "You should have listened." The words echoed through the car like they were inside my head, inside my bones. I don't remember much after that, just the door unlocking itself, the sound of my heartbeat in my ears, and the fog swirling, closing in around us like it was pulling us towards something worse than death. The fog was pressing in, thick and suffocating, as if it had a life of its own, and I couldn't help but feel that the very air around us was a trap, a living thing suffocating us inch by inch. Mira and I stood frozen in place, her grip tightening around my arm like she was afraid I might disappear into the mist at any second. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around, panic rising in her chest. I don't know, I managed to say. I was still in shock, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum, my head spinning. But in the back of my mind, there was one thought that kept repeating, get out, run. But no matter how much I told myself to move, I couldn't seem to summon the strength to do it. The burned ones were getting closer. Their smoke-shrouded figures drifted in and out of focus as if they were both there and not there at the same time. Their limbs twisted unnaturally, bending in ways that bodies weren't meant to bend. And though their forms were nothing but smoke, I could feel the weight of their presence like an oppressive force that pressed in on me, suffocating me from all sides. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It was like I was trapped in a dream, unable to move, unable to wake up. Lena. Mira's voice broke through the fog of my thoughts, her hand on my shoulder. Lena, we need to move. We need to get out of here, please. Her eyes were wide with fear, and I could see her own terror reflected in them. I nodded, the realization of our situation slowly sinking in, dragging me out of the haze of shock. We couldn't stay here. I finally managed to force my legs to move, stumbling toward the car. But as I stepped away from the shelter of the vehicle, the fog seemed to close in tighter around us, and I could feel the presence of the burned ones growing stronger, like they were drawing closer, inch by inch. The radio crackled again, that same disembodied voice cutting through the air like a blade. You should have listened. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, and Mira nearly stumbled into me as she caught herself. The voice wasn't just coming from the radio now, it was coming from the very air around us. It was like the fog itself was speaking, mocking us. Mira's hand shot out, gripping my wrist. We need to go. Now. We moved quickly now, our feet sinking into the damp earth beneath us, the forest stretching out in all directions like a maze. But no matter which way we turned, the fog seemed to follow. The trees around us were no help, their gnarled trunks and twisted limbs barely visible through the haze, their branches hanging low as if they were reaching for us. We didn't speak. There were no words left, only the sound of our feet crunching on the undergrowth and the oppressive weight of the fog pressing down around us. The burned ones were still there, just out of sight, but I could feel them. They were watching us, waiting. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my chest tightening with every step. It felt like we were walking in circles, like the forest itself was conspiring to keep us here. I glanced at Mira. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and I knew she could feel it too, the feeling that we weren't going to get out of here. I couldn't shake the image of Jake's body, twisted and contorted by the smoke. Jake wasn't coming back. He was gone, and we were next. I couldn't stop the tremor that ran through me. I had to stay calm. I had to keep it together for both of us, but the fear clawing at my chest was becoming unbearable. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the distance sent me into a full-on panic. Lena, look! Mira gasped, her hand jerking toward the trees ahead of us. Through the thick fog, I could just make out the shape of something, or someone moving, toward us. At first I thought it was just another trick of the fog, but then it stepped into the clearing and I saw it clearly. It was one of the burned ones. Its body was a twisted mass of smoke and ash, its limbs elongated and unnaturally thin, its face nothing more than a shadow. But there was something about it, something in its movements that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just that it was made of smoke. It was that it didn't move like something that was alive. It moved like a predator, calculating and slow, as if it were savoring the chase. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. Run! I screamed. And Mira didn't hesitate. She tore off into the woods and I followed her, my heart pounding, in my chest, my legs burning from the effort. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in, the fog making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But even though we were running, the burned one was always just behind, us just out of sight, but I could feel its presence. It was getting closer. My lungs burned with every breath, and I could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at my body. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let up. If I did, I knew I'd never get out of here. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I saw something, a light, faint but unmistakable, flickering in the distance. I turned to Mira, grabbing her arm. "That way. There's light." Without waiting for her to respond, I dragged her toward it, pushing through the thick fog, praying that it wasn't just another hallucination. We stumbled toward the light, our feet slipping in the wet earth, the fog closing in around us like it was trying to drag us back into its depths. But then the trees opened up ahead, and there it was, an old cabin barely visible through the mist. A small flicker of hope sparked inside me, but as we got closer, the fog thickened, swirling around the cabin like it was alive. I could feel the presence of the burned ones closing in, their shapes shifting in the fog, their twisted forms just beyond the edge of my vision. "Please," I whispered, grabbing the doorknob and pushing it open. "Please, let this be real." And when the door creaked open, revealing nothing but blackness inside, I knew that no matter where we went, we would never escape this place. The fog was waiting, the burned ones were waiting, and we were already too late. The world outside had blurred into a whirl of shadows and fog. My heart thundered in my chest as I pushed the door open and stepped into the cabin, hoping against everything that it might be a refuge. But as I crossed the threshold, a heavy weight settled in the pit of my stomach. The air inside the cabin was damp, stale, and suffocating. The musty smell of rotting wood mixed with something off. It wasn't just old, it was decayed, forgotten. I glanced back over my shoulder, praying to see the lights of the road, but the fog had swallowed it all. We were completely cut off. The thick, swirling fog outside seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. Mira stumbled in behind me, her chest heaving with each breath, her wide, frightened eyes darting around the room. What is this place?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I didn't have an answer for her, nor for myself. I didn't know if it was the fog or the cabin itself, but the entire scene felt like it was closing in on us, as if the very air we were breathing was trying to strangle us. The cabin was sparsely furnished. There was a faded armchair near the fireplace, a dust-covered table in the corner, and a small shelf lined with dusty books. The windows were covered in grime, barely letting in the dim light from outside, but they were all shut tight, locked in place, as if no one had lived there in years. But despite the sense of abandonment, there was an undeniable feeling that we weren't alone. My skin crawled. Every corner of the room seemed to hold a dark secret, the shadows lurking where the light couldn't reach. I tried to steady my breath, trying to collect myself. We were safe for now, at least. But for how long? "Maybe we should go upstairs," Mira suggested, her voice low and uncertain. "There could be another way out." I didn't answer her immediately. My eyes lingered on the narrow staircase that led up to a small landing. The steps creaked with age, the wood groaning under the weight of time. But there was something about that staircase, something that didn't sit right with me. It was as though it beckoned us, luring us towards something we didn't want to face. Before I could say anything, there was a sharp bang from outside, a thud that echoed against the walls of the cabin, sending both of us into a panicked frenzy. "What was that?" Mira gasped, her hand clutching my arm. I didn't know what to say. The fog outside had become oppressive, thick as a wall, and the shape of the trees had disappeared, swallowed whole by the swirling mist. It was as if the world beyond had been consumed by it. And then a low, distorted voice reached our ears. It wasn't from any of us. It wasn't from the radio, the walls, or the trees. It was just there. "You're too late." The words were stretched out like they were being dragged across time, and they made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Mira froze beside me, her eyes wide in terror. "It's them," I whispered, my throat dry. "It's the burned ones." The door to the cabin creaked behind us, and I whipped around, expecting to see something, anything. But when I saw the door slowly inch open on its own, my heart skipped a beat. The fog swirled through the gap, thickening as if it were alive, curling in on itself, pushing its way inside. They were here. The figure that appeared in the doorway wasn't fully formed. Its edges were blurry, the smoke shifting and writhing as if it was struggling to maintain a human shape. But I could see the tall, thin figure, the elongated limbs, and the hollow, darkened shape of what might have been a face. It was not alive, just a wraith drifting in from the mist, pulling its form together as it entered. Before I could speak, the fog slammed the door shut behind it, trapping us inside. We were surrounded. I felt a tightness in my chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The smoke curled around us, thick and choking, slipping through cracks in the walls, gathering into corners like it had a will of its own. I looked at Mira, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. We didn't have much time. "Mira," I said urgently, my voice trembling, "we need to leave now." But when I moved toward the door, I saw that it was no longer just the one figure in the doorway. There were others, shapes forming and dissolving in the fog, coming closer, their movement too fluid, too fast to be natural. The smoke twisted around them, wrapping itself in a spiral of ash and shadows. "We can't outrun them," I said, my voice shaking as the weight of realization hit me. "We're trapped." I backed away slowly, my eyes darting between the growing figures, panic creeping up my spine. Mira, for all her strength, was pale with fear, her lips parted as if she wanted to scream but couldn't find her voice. But then in the back of my mind I heard a memory, a warning that my grandmother had told me long ago. "When the smoke curls backward, mija, you run." I didn't know if it was too late. I didn't know if running would even help us now. But it was all I had left. The very air around us felt like it was choking us, pushing against us, as if the world itself was trying to swallow us whole. I grabbed Mira's hand, pulling her toward the stairs, toward any way out of this suffocating nightmare. The figures in the fog followed us, no longer bound by the physical limits of the world. They moved freely through the space, like the smoke itself had claimed them, and they were drawing closer by the second. We had no choice. We had to run. We had to escape. I only hoped that we weren't already too late. The stairs groaned beneath our feet as we ascended, the wood creaking with every step we took, as if the house itself was warning us not to go further. Mira's hand was clammy in mine, her breath shallow and fast, but I couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The fog was pressing in around the cabin, thickening like an encroaching tide, swallowing the walls, the windows, everything. I could feel the weight of the air pushing against my chest, the oppressive presence of the figures in the fog reaching through the cracks of the walls, clawing at us. But I didn't dare look back. The more I thought about it, the more the fog felt like it was alive, something with a malevolent intelligence, something that was learning, watching. The top of the stairs revealed a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the yellowed patterns curling at the edges like the decay had seeped into the very fabric of the house. The smell of rot had become overwhelming, and I could feel the air around me, growing colder like winter itself had taken hold of the cabin. "Which room?" Mira gasped, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. I wasn't sure there was anywhere left to hide, but instinct pushed me toward the first door on the left. I pulled it open and stumbled inside, dragging Mira with me. The room was small, an old bedroom with a sagging bed and a cracked window that allowed just enough fog inside to make everything feel blurry and unreal. I slammed the door shut behind us, but even as I turned the lock, I could feel the presence outside, the smoke curling around the edges of the door, slipping through, the cracks like it was trying to get in. What are we supposed to do now? Mira's voice broke through my thoughts, her eyes wide with panic. She was shaking, her breath coming in sharp, quick gasps. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. There was nothing left to say. We were trapped. The fog was everywhere, and the figures, the burned ones, were still out there, waiting for us to make a move. It wasn't just the house that was closing in on us, it was the forest, the fog, everything. We were in the middle of it now, and there was no way out. My mind raced, trying to think of something, anything that could help us. And then I remembered Abuela's words. "When the smoke curls backward, mija, you run." It was too late to run. The fog had already claimed us. But maybe we could make the fog work for us. Maybe if we confronted it, we could break free. I didn't know how, but I had to try. I had to do something. Mira, I said, trying to steady my voice. We need to get to the center of it. The fog. It's like a trap. If we stay here, it'll just get worse. What? Mira's eyes darted to the door, to the shifting shadows outside, to the smoke that was creeping in beneath the door. Are you crazy? You want to go out there? You saw what happened to Jake. I know, I whispered, my heart pounding. But staying here won't help. If we go to the center of the fog, we might be able to break whatever hold it has over us. We need to find a way to make it stop. We have to. Mira stared at me, her breath shaky. I could see the fear in her eyes, but I also saw something else. Something familiar. The need to survive. You're right, she finally said, her voice low but determined. Let's do it. We moved to the door, the air thick with the sound of our breaths, but just as I reached for the knob, I heard something. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't just in the air. It was in the walls, vibrating through the house like something trying to claw its way in. My heart stopped. And then, the door burst open. The fog rushed in, cold and suffocating, like the very breath of death itself. It poured into the room, filling every corner, every crevice. The figures in the mist were there, their shapes barely discernible, their movements too quick to track. The ground beneath us seemed to shift, and before I could react, Mira was yanked backward, her scream swallowed by the fog as a long, thin arm shot out of the mist, dragging her into the darkness. I reached for her, my hand slipping into the thick smoke, but I couldn't find her. It was like she had disappeared, swallowed whole by the mist. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stumbled back, my vision blurring, the smoke clawing at me, suffocating me. I was alone. The fog was everywhere now, a relentless tide pushing against me, pulling me under. The figures in the mist had lost all semblance of humanity. They were just shapes now, shifting shadows with empty faces, their bodies dissolving and reforming in an endless loop. They moved like smoke itself, sliding in and out of reality. And then I saw him. Jake. His face was half melted, his skin peeling away in wisps of smoke, his body jerking and twisting in unnatural angles. He reached for me, but it wasn't Jake anymore. It was something else, something that wore his face. The voice from the radio echoed in my mind, distorted, like a warning from the past. You should have listened. I turned to run, but my legs were heavy as though the fog was pulling me down, dragging me back into the darkness. The smoke swirled around me, forming into a vortex, and I couldn't breathe. I heard Mira's voice, weak, distant, barely a whisper. But it was enough. Don't follow the smoke. The last thing I saw was the fog closing in around me, swallowing me whole. Days later, a group of hikers stumbled across the abandoned car, the interior scorched with strange burns. The camera inside held only one photo. Me, standing in the fog, my face half eroded into smoke. I've been to countless places for work, places that should be off the map, where people still whisper about the old ways, where superstition runs deeper than the soil itself. It's part of my job as a journalist to poke through these stories, to tear them apart, to prove them for the nonsense they usually are. So when the opportunity to visit Blackmore came up, I jumped on it. The village, tucked away in the foggy moors of northern England, had long been a topic of fascination for tourists and armchair occultists. It was the kind of place where even the most skeptical person might start wondering if there was something to all the stories. Blackmore was isolated, cut off from the modern world, and it wore its isolation like a badge of pride. I arrived on October 31st, All Hallows Eve, thinking it would be the perfect time to get a good angle. The villagers were already huddled in their homes, preparing for what they called the gathering, a celebration of the dead, or perhaps, as some would argue, an invitation to them. The fog seemed to roll in thicker as I approached, suffocating everything around me. The streets were empty, but the strange sense of anticipation was palpable, thick as the air itself. I made my way to the center of town, my boots squelching in the wet earth. At the heart of the village stood the wailing oak. It was an ancient, twisted thing, its bark gnarled and scarred like the flesh of some long-forgotten beast. The tree was massive, reaching far above the other trees in the forest, its branches heavy with what looked like dark knots, like eyes watching you, always waiting. The locals said it had stood since the witch burnings, an ancient relic of a time when the village's secrets were darker than the moors themselves. As I approached, I noticed the villagers watching me from their windows. I caught their eyes, but they quickly turned away. There was something eerie about their silence, as if they were afraid to speak to me, afraid I might disturb something they had learned to respect. "Don't touch the oak," old Maggie Cray had warned me earlier that day when I asked about it in the inn. She had spat on the ground when she said it, her ancient eyes hard with a warning that didn't quite match the frailness of her form. "Never mock it, never carve your name in it. You'll be waking up something you don't want to." I had laughed it off. Maggie Cray was nothing more than a relic of Blackmore's superstitious past, someone who had long since outlived her usefulness. The last wise woman of the village, they called her, and I couldn't help but smile. These kinds of people, the ones who cling to old legends, were always the easiest to debunk. And so, in my usual fashion, I decided to do exactly what they told me not to do. That night, after a few too many drinks at the inn, I grabbed my pocket knife and made my way back to the oak, my mind still buzzing from the whiskey and the feeling of invincibility. The villagers had gone to bed, and the wind had kicked up, howling through the trees like the voices of the dead. The tree loomed in front of me, its silhouette barely visible through the thick fog. I approached it slowly, looking up at its massive trunk. With a smirk, I raised my knife, carving my name, L. Hale was here, deep into the twisted bark. A chill ran through me, like the air itself had thickened. Then something happened that I couldn't explain. The tree bled. Thick, black sap oozed from the wound in the trunk, dripping onto the ground beneath it. My stomach churned at the sight. And then I heard it. A low, sobbing sound, like a woman crying in the distance, distant yet painfully close. The wind howled, but the sound was unmistakable. I staggered backward, my pulse quickening. My eyes darted around, searching for any signs of movement, but there was nothing. The sobbing continued, but I brushed it off as a trick of the night. With a nervous laugh, I turned on my heel and headed back to the inn, the sounds of the crying woman echoing in my ears. I was too drunk to think clearly. I convinced myself that the noise, the sap, the eerie chill, it was all just a combination of the fog, the booze, and my overactive imagination. But as I stumbled back to my room, something in me couldn't shake the feeling that I had just done, something I couldn't undo. The next few days in Blackmore were a blur. I spent most of my time holed up in my room, writing up my initial thoughts, trying to piece together the details of the village's strange history. But I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to the wailing oak, to that moment when I carved my name into its twisted bark, the sobbing sound, the way the tree had bled. It lingered in my thoughts like an itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to dismiss it, of course. It was nothing. Just a combination of being drunk, the creepy old legends of the village, and the heavy fog that always seemed to swallow everything whole. But the truth is, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By day 2, things started to get strange. It wasn't anything overt, but I noticed small things that I couldn't explain away so easily. It began with the camera. I had brought it along with me to document the trip. I was planning to write an article about Blackmore, focusing on the village's superstitions and how these old beliefs were still clinging to life in modern England. But when I tried to upload my photos that evening, something was off. Every single shot I had taken showed my face, rotting. The images were grainy and out of focus, as though they had been taken with an old camera from the 1800s. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was my reflection. My skin looked decayed, my eyes hollow, like something dead looking back at me. First, I thought it was just a glitch, maybe the result of a faulty camera or something I hadn't noticed in the lens. I even tried erasing the pictures, restarting the camera, but the same thing happened when I took a few more. My skin, my face, it was rotting away in every shot. I cursed under my breath, frustrated, trying to clear my head. On day 3, I woke up to find my reflection in the bathroom mirror blinking out of sync. It sounds crazy, but that's what happened. I was brushing my teeth when I caught sight of myself in the mirror. For a second, I thought I had imagined it, but no. There it was. I blinked and my reflection stayed still, staring back at me for just a moment longer than it should have. Then it blinked, but not in time with me. I froze, toothpaste still in my mouth, the brush hanging loosely in my hand. My reflection's eyes, those hollow, dead eyes, seemed to follow me as I backed away from the mirror. It was like it was watching me, waiting for me to move, and it moved after me, not like it was mimicking me. It was different, distant, as though it was watching from the other side of the glass, not really me at all. I tried to convince myself it was another trick of the mind. The kind of thing that happens when you've been isolated in a foggy village for too long, away from everything familiar. A lack of sleep, maybe a touch of delirium, but I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake how real it felt. By day 5, things escalated. I woke up to find my bed sheets tangled in a mess of oak leaves. They were everywhere, scattered in the folds, between the sheets, in the blankets, and the window was locked. I hadn't left it open, and yet the leaves were there, fresh leaves. They smelled earthy, like they had just been plucked from the ground outside. I checked the window again, convinced I had made a mistake, but it was locked. The leaves were inexplicable. I didn't know where they had come from, and when I tried to tell myself I had been sleepwalking or something equally ridiculous, the unease settled deeper in my chest. That night I tried to sleep with the lights on just to feel normal again. But as I lay there, I could hear that faint sound in the distance, carried by the wind, the sobbing. That same mournful, heart-wrenching sound that had followed me the night I carved my name into the oak. I tried to ignore it, tried to close my ears to it, but it didn't stop. It was always there, just beneath the howl of the wind, a constant reminder that I had done something that couldn't be undone. I walked through the village the next morning, hoping to clear my head, but the villagers avoided me. They wouldn't meet my eyes, would cross themselves when I walked by. I could feel their eyes on my back, watching me from their windows, whispering behind closed doors. Even the doctor, who had been tending to my minor injuries from the trip, gave me a wary glance when I came in to see him. He didn't say anything, but I could see the fear in his eyes. When I asked him if he knew anything about the oak, he stiffened, then mumbled something about not disturbing the old spirits. Later that afternoon, I went back to the oak. I didn't want to, not really, but something inside me pushed me to do it. Maybe it was the strange sensation that I had already crossed a line, and that I needed to confront whatever it was I had stirred up. The oak stood there, gnarled and dark, its bark still oozing thick black sap from the wound I had carved into it. I felt the same uneasy feeling wash over me as I approached. The air around the tree was colder, and the sobbing sound, almost imperceptible but ever-present, seemed to rise and fall with the wind. I looked at the carving I had made. The words, "El Hail" was here, still faintly visible, though the tree seemed to have grown around them. The bark had begun to close over the cuts, but they weren't fully healed. It was like the tree was waiting. And then, the wind picked up again, a gust that carried the familiar sobbing. It sounded closer now, almost as though it was right behind me. I turned, my heart hammering, but there was no one there. The wind died down, and I stood there, frozen, wondering what the hell I had gotten myself into. The days following my second visit to the Wailing Oak only got worse. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but the dread that had settled in my chest was becoming unbearable. The villagers weren't wrong. Something had been disturbed when I carved my name into that ancient tree. I had mocked the old superstition, laughed it off as local folklore, and now I was paying the price for my arrogance. By day 7, The changes had become impossible to ignore. My skin began to break out in strange, bark-like lesions. They weren't like regular rashes or pimples. These were thick, dark patches that looked like the surface of wood, rough and textured, as though my skin had started to mimic the oak itself. I could feel them on my arms, on the back of my neck, creeping up my chest. They burned and itched, but when I tried to scratch them, they didn't heal. Instead, they grew larger, spreading across my skin like some kind of infection. At first, I thought it was an allergic reaction, maybe to something I had touched or breathed in during my visit to the oak. I went to see the village doctor again, hoping he could give me something to relieve the pain. But when he saw my skin, his face drained of color. He backed away from me, his eyes wide with what I can only describe as fear. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, his voice trembling. You should leave Blackmore. Now." I was taken aback. I had come to him for help, and instead he was telling me to leave. I pressed him, asking what was going on, but he wouldn't say anything more. After a few moments of silence, he just told me to go, that there was nothing he could do. As I left his office, I could see the other villagers staring at me. They didn't speak to me, but they looked at me with wide, fearful eyes, as though they knew something I didn't. I was already feeling like an outsider in this place, but now it seemed like I had become something even worse. The oak, and whatever curse I had triggered, was spreading, and it was starting to change me. By day 9, things had escalated even further. The lesions on my skin began to pulse faintly, as though something was alive beneath the surface. At night I could hear something. Whispers, faint and distant, like the sound of the wind through leaves, but also different, almost as if something was trying to speak through me. I could feel it, the pressure in my chest, like my very bones were being reshaped by the whispers. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the distinct feeling that something was watching me, something that wasn't human. I tried to ignore it, but it was becoming harder. My reflection in mirrors began to distort, just like the camera had shown me days earlier. It wasn't just that my skin looked unhealthy, or that my face seemed older. There were moments when I looked into the glass and didn't recognize myself at all. My eyes, they were darker now, almost hollow, and my reflection would blink at the wrong time, out of sync with me. I tried to convince myself it was the stress, the isolation. I had been pushing myself too hard with the writing, trying to get everything done before my deadline. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever I had done, whatever I had awakened with that knife, was working its way under my skin, into my mind. I could feel the oak's curse, and it was taking hold of me piece by piece. And then, on day 10, the worst thing happened. I woke up to find the leaves. They were everywhere, tangled in my bed sheets, in my clothes, in my hair. Not just a few leaves, there were hundreds of them. And they were oak leaves. I could tell by their distinctive shape, the jagged edges. I hadn't been outside the house. For days, hadn't even opened the window. My room had been locked, and yet these leaves, fresh and wet with dew, had somehow found their way in. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was still locked, the window sealed, tight. There was no way they could have gotten in through the normal routes. This was something else. I tried to shake the feeling, but I knew deep down that the oak was reaching into my life. It wasn't just the lesions on my skin anymore, or the strange distortion of my reflection. The tree had begun to invade my very existence. That night, as I sat in my room, staring at the leaves scattered around me, I remembered something Maggie Cray had said the day I arrived in Blackmore. "You woke her. Now she's hungry." The words replayed in my mind like an omen. I had woken something ancient, something vengeful, and now it was coming for me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to go back to the oak. I had to find out what I could do to stop this. If there was even a way to stop it at all. I knew the villagers wouldn't help me. They were too afraid of the truth. They had lived in Blackmore all their lives, and they knew what happened to those who disturbed the oak. But I was a journalist. I couldn't run. Not without trying to understand the curse that had already begun to take me. I could feel the air, growing heavier, pressing down on me with every step I took toward the wailing oak. It was as though the very ground beneath me was aware of my intentions, as though it had already decided my fate. The wind, which had been howling the night before, had died down, leaving a thick, unsettling silence in its wake. But there was something else, something unspoken and invisible, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. I had spent the morning gathering information, trying to piece together anything I could find about the oak's history and the curse the villagers spoke of in hushed tones. But there was little to be found. Blackmore, as isolated as it was, had kept its secrets buried for centuries. No one wrote about it. No one dared. It wasn't until I ventured to the town's archives, an old, crumbling building near the edge of the village, that I found anything remotely useful. The documents were weathered, some of them too brittle to touch without fear of destroying them. But I managed to find an account from the early 1700s, a time when the witch burnings still cast their long shadow over Blackmore. In it, there was a mention of the oak. It was said that the tree had been planted during the trial of a woman accused of witchcraft. The villagers believed that it held the spirit of the woman who had been executed, and her vengeful curse had kept the tree alive for centuries. The account was vague, offering no real answers. But it did confirm what I had already suspected. I had awakened something, and whatever it was angry. By late afternoon, I couldn't stand being in the village any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that the oak was calling to me. I had to return to it. I had to face whatever lay in wait for me. I walked to the inn to gather my things, determined to leave Blackmore and head back to London. But something in my gut told me that running would be pointless. The curse wasn't just tied to the village. It had already attached itself to me. When I arrived at the oak that night, the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the world into an impenetrable darkness. The tree stood before me, its branches twisted and knotted, a gnarled silhouette against the dark sky. The air was colder here, sharper. My breath hung in the air like smoke, and I could hear the faintest whisper in the wind. I approached the oak slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no turning back now. The carvings I had made, "El Hail was here," had somehow morphed. The words had spread, the bark around them pulling together like flesh over an old wound. And now when I looked at the tree, the message was different. El Hail stays here. The truth hit me like a physical blow. I was trapped. This wasn't just about my name, this was about ownership, about possession. The oak wasn't just marking my presence, it was claiming me. I had no choice but to act. I had heard whispers from Maggie Cray, the last remaining wise woman of Blackmore, about an old ritual, a desperate measure that might ease the curse. But it was a gamble. It was a ritual of appeasement, and I had no idea if it would work, or if it would make things worse. Maggie had told me that I needed 3 things: a lock of my hair, 3 drops of my blood, and a circle of salt. It sounded absurd, but I had no other options. With shaking hands, I pulled out the pocket knife from my jacket pocket, the same one I had used to carve my name into the oak. I cut a small lock of my hair and placed it in the center of a ring of salt I drew around the tree. The salt was meant to create a barrier, to keep whatever spirit or force had been awakened at bay. I hesitated for a moment before I pricked my finger, letting 3 drops of my blood fall onto the roots of the tree. The dark sap that had oozed from the oak before seemed to stir at the contact, pulsing faintly beneath the surface of the bark. I stood there for a long time, watching the salt circle and the blood slowly seep into the ground. The wind had picked up again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the howling gusts I had heard before. It was a scream, a deep, guttural scream carried on the wind, like a woman crying out in pain. The sound seemed to wrap around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I closed my eyes and whispered the plea I had been told to say. "Please, I beg you, let me go. I did not know what I had awoken. I do not want this curse." The wind screamed again, louder this time, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. The air was thick with energy, electric and volatile. I could feel the oak shifting, groaning like something waking from a long slumber. And then, as quickly as it started, everything stopped. The wind died down, The air grew still. I opened my eyes, expecting something to happen, some sign that the curse had been lifted, that I was free. But nothing had changed. The oak stood there, as imposing and dark as it had been before, its branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. I took a deep breath, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my back. I couldn't be sure. Had the ritual worked or had it failed? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. Blackmore had left its mark on me. As I turned to leave, the wind whispered one last time. This time it wasn't the woman's sobs I heard. It was a soft, mocking laugh like a whisper in the back of my mind. And as I walked away from the oak, I couldn't help but feel the weight of something following me. The curse hadn't been lifted. It had only shifted. The night air was still as I made my way back to the village, but the silence felt different now. Oppressive, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the usual quiet of Blackmore that hung heavy over me. It was the feeling that something had changed, that something was waiting, watching, and it wasn't just the villagers I had to worry about anymore. The ritual had been my last attempt to break free. I had done everything I could, everything Maggie had told me. But as I walked away from the wailing oak, the wind carried that laughter again, soft and low, slipping through the cracks of my consciousness. It wasn't in my ears. It was inside my head, twisting and turning, like the oak itself had burrowed into my mind, rooting itself deep in the corners of my thoughts. I tried to push it away. I told myself I had done what I needed to do, that I had appeased whatever spirit or force had claimed the oak. But the nagging feeling, something gnawing at my core, refused to go away. I knew deep down that the ritual hadn't worked. It wasn't enough. The curse was still there, and it was only a matter of time before it came back for me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows in my room were too thick, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I tossed and turned in the bed, the room growing colder with each passing minute. The whispers, those faint, almost imperceptible voices, began again. At first they were soft, barely more than a murmur. But the longer I lay still, the clearer they became. "El Hale stays here." I sat up, heart racing. The words weren't just in my mind. They echoed from the walls, from the floor beneath me, like they were coming from the very air itself. I tried to push myself up, to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the very air had thickened, holding me in place. My limbs felt heavy, as though I were being pulled deeper into the bed, deeper into the darkness. And then, through the thickening fog of my fear, I saw it. The shadow. It was standing at the foot of my bed, dark and formless, its edges flickering, like smoke in the dim light of the room. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it. Feel its presence like a weight in the room. I could hear its breath, slow and shallow, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. I tried to speak, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, as if something was choking me from the inside. The shadow shifted, its form stretching, reaching toward me. And that's when I saw it. The oak, its gnarled branches, its twisted bark, its massive trunk looming behind the shadow. The oak wasn't just a tree anymore. It was everywhere. It was in my room. It was inside me. I gasped for air, struggling against the unseen force holding me down. But it was no use. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow reached closer, and I could feel its cold fingers brush against my face. "Why did you wake me?" the voice whispered. It wasn't the woman sobbing anymore. It was calm, almost soothing. But I knew better. I knew it wasn't really her. It was it. The thing that had been waiting all these years. The oak had no mercy. I fought harder, my body convulsing against the weight of the curse that had already sunk its roots into me. I couldn't escape it. I knew then that I never would. I had become part of Blackmore, part of the oak's curse. It had chosen me, and now I was bound to it. The shadow moved closer, and I felt the cold embrace of its presence, wrapping itself around me, pulling me toward the darkness. When I woke up the next morning, I was lying in the same bed. The sun was rising, weak and sickly through the fog. I blinked, disoriented, unsure if I had been dreaming or if what I had felt was real. But as I sat up, the first thing I noticed was the smell. The unmistakable scent of damp earth and rotting leaves clinging to my clothes, my skin, my very being. I looked in the mirror, half expecting to see the same distorted, rotting face I had seen in my photos. But I was still me. At least I looked like me. My skin was smooth again, no lesions, no scars, but something was off. My reflection, it wasn't right. My eyes, once dark, had turned black like hollow voids that stared back at me with an unsettling emptiness. And when I blinked, my reflection blinked in slow motion, out of sync. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The curse had settled in. It had claimed me. I thought I was free, that the ritual had worked, but I had been wrong. The oak had won. I left Blackmore the next day, or at least I tried to. I left behind the village, the oak, and everything I thought I had understood, but the curse followed me. It followed me everywhere, in every reflection, in every shadow. And now, as I write this, no longer in the village, but somewhere far from. That cursed place, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves never leaves me. My articles still get published, but they always arrive at the editorial office smelling of the same sickly scent. And when the wind howls just right, I can hear it. The faintest whisper, far in the distance, rising on the breeze. El Hail stays, here. The curse never truly fades, it only waits, and it waits for me. The house sat at the edge of Stillwater, Vermont, a lonely, sprawling Victorian farmhouse that always seemed to be shrouded in mist. It had once been a place of warmth, with the laughter of children echoing off the walls, the smell of apple pie wafting through the air, and the sound of the wind howling through the eaves on cold winter nights. That was before we lost our dreams and before the nursery we'd built for a child remained empty, its pastel walls peeling like the scars they had become in my wife Evelyn's heart. It had been 5 years since the miscarriages started. 5 years since the doctors gave us the same answer every time. We don't know why. It just happens. And in those 5 years, our dreams of having a family had decayed like the crumbling foundation of our farmhouse. The nursery, once a sanctuary for all the hopes we had for a child, was a tomb of silent walls, its cheerful decor mocking us with its vacancy. Evelyn had tried to hold on to hope, but each loss was like a dagger, piercing deeper into her heart. She withdrew into herself, her once bright smile dimming to a faint shadow of what it had been. Her eyes, once filled with life, now seemed hollow. I could see the grief slowly turning her into something distant, something I no longer knew. We hadn't spoken much about the future, about what came next, but I knew we couldn't stay this way forever. Then came the call from Blackwood Orphanage. The orphanage was a place most people in Stillwater whispered about in hushed tones, always avoiding it when they passed by. I'd heard rumors, stories, that the children there never stayed long with one family before being moved on to the next. Most families didn't adopt from Blackwood, but Evelyn, her heart shattered into pieces, grasping at the sliver of hope we both so desperately needed, insisted on it. She wanted a child, any child. When we went to meet her, Alice seemed perfect, too perfect. Her porcelain skin was as white as the snow that blanketed the hills outside, and her eyes, those eyes, were so dark, so full of something that felt ancient. She was 6 years old, but there was something about her that felt older. Her gaze didn't seem to belong to a child. It felt as though she had seen and understood things that children shouldn't know. But when she smiled, it was the kind of smile that melted every ounce of doubt I had, leaving me vulnerable to whatever was to come. The matron of the orphanage was a stern woman with a permanent frown on her face. She told us that Alice had no history, no family, no past. She simply appeared one winter night, brought to the orphanage with nothing but the dress on her back and a name stitched into the fabric, Alice Voss. We didn't ask questions. We didn't need to. Evelyn was already in love with her, and I could see the joy in her eyes for the first time in years. So we signed the papers and took her home. At first, things were perfect. Too perfect. Alice settled into the nursery with a quiet grace, as if it had always been hers. She hums lullabies, melodies that Evelyn swears she never taught her. I'd find her at night curled up in her little bed, eyes closed, lips moving as if speaking to someone invisible. I never questioned it. I should have. But I didn't. It wasn't long before things started to feel off. One evening, while I was upstairs in the attic, I heard Evelyn gasp. I rushed down to find her standing in the kitchen, her eyes wide with shock. There were scratch marks on her arm, deep, angry marks, as if someone, or something, had dragged their claws across her skin, but there was no one there. "It's her," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "She's doing it." I didn't know what she meant at first. But then I saw it too. Alice's behavior started changing. She began drawing things on the walls of the nursery, intricate spiraling patterns that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. I asked her about it, but she simply smiled, her eyes too wide. "They told me to," she said. "They're hungry." The cats started hissing when she passed, their fur bristling, their bodies arching in terror. The roses in the garden, which had once bloomed in rich reds and yellows, began to wilt wherever Alice walked. But the worst part came when Evelyn began waking up with strange marks on her body, crimson lines etched into her belly, not wounds, but symbols. Ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just stress. But deep down, I felt the weight of something dark and ancient settling into our home. And I knew somehow that Alice, this child with no past, was at the center of it all. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to protect my wife from this thing we'd brought into our lives. But I would find out soon enough. I didn't tell Evelyn what I was really thinking. I couldn't. She was already so fragile, so vulnerable to the possibility that everything we'd hoped for, everything we'd dreamed of, might crumble once again. After the miscarriages, she'd been left broken, unable to even imagine our future in the same way she once had. Now, with Alice in our lives, there was a fragile sense of hope. But even in the soft light of that hope, there was something else. Something wrong. The scratches on her belly started to get worse. They appeared out of nowhere, deep, jagged lines, not like anything you'd get from an accident. I know this because I saw it happen with my own eyes. She'd wake up in the middle of the night gasping for air, her skin marked as if someone had carved into her while she slept. Evelyn was convinced it was Alice. She kept saying that Alice was talking to them. The lost children, the ones she believed had come to claim her. I didn't know what to believe. It felt like one of those fever dreams you can't quite shake off, but I couldn't ignore it. Something was happening, something I didn't understand, and the woman I loved, the woman who had carried so much grief for so long, was starting to slip further away from me. I tried to talk to Alice, to ask her about the scratches, about the strange things she'd been doing in the nursery. But she just smiled at me with those big, dark eyes of hers, the kind of smile that makes your heart stop for a second, and said, "They said I can help her." I didn't know what she meant. I didn't know if I wanted to know. One night after Evelyn had gone to bed, I went into the nursery alone. I couldn't help it. There was something pulling me in, a need to understand, to see if what was happening was real. Alice had been in there earlier, her back turned as she scribbled something in a notebook that she'd never shown anyone. I'd heard her hum that tune again, the one that felt as though it had come from a time before us, before anyone. I stood there for a long time, just watching her drawings. They were more intricate now, swirling lines that didn't make any sense, symbols that seemed too ancient, too deliberate. I couldn't read them, couldn't understand what they were supposed to mean. But as I looked at them in the pale moonlight, I felt like they were staring back at me, It was as though they were alive. Suddenly, I heard a creak behind me. I spun around, but the nursery door was closed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the shadows. I felt it then, something cold and unseen, creeping up behind me like a breath on the back of my neck. When I turned back to the wall, the symbols were glowing faintly, just enough to catch the light. And that's when I saw it. Right in the middle of the drawings, there was a new symbol, one I hadn't seen before, a spiraling, circular design with lines that seemed to move. I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. A low hum filled the room, a sound that felt almost like a whisper, though I couldn't understand the words. And then I heard Evelyn's voice, faint and distant, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. "Daniel," she called softly. "Come here." I ran to her, panic rushing through me. But when I found her, she wasn't in bed. She was standing by the window, staring out into the dark night. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her hands were pressed against her stomach, as though she were holding something inside. I reached out to touch her, but she flinched, pulling away. "Evelyn, what's happening?" I asked, my voice breaking. She turned slowly, her eyes wide and wild. "I can feel them, Daniel. The babies. They're inside me again." Her belly had swollen unnaturally fast, as though she had been pregnant for months instead of days. And when I looked at her, really looked at her, I saw it. The way her skin had begun to stretch, the unnatural glow beneath it. It wasn't a baby. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be. "I don't understand," I said, panic rising in my chest. "How is this possible?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But they're here. They're coming." She promised me, Daniel. Alice promised me I could have them back. All of them. I felt the coldness in her words, a chill that made my heart skip a beat. Alice, this child with no past, had somehow done this. She had made my wife believe that the lost children, the ones we could never hold, could come back. But at what cost? I couldn't think straight. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to believe it was just my wife's fragile mind slipping, that this was some delusion brought on by grief. But deep down I knew better. I knew something was wrong. And I knew that whatever was inside her, whatever Alice had promised her, was not human. The sound of scratching came again, this time from the walls. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what Alice was, and I had to do it fast before Evelyn, or worse, the thing inside her, was consumed completely. I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling in my gut, the weight of dread that settled over me like the darkened clouds that rolled in over the hills every evening. It was suffocating. Every breath I took felt harder than the last, and every corner of this farmhouse felt more like a prison than a home. But the real prison I knew was Evelyn, the way she'd changed, the way she no longer looked at me with love, but with something deeper, something desperate. I had to understand. I had to find out what Alice was, what she had done to my wife. I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, after Evelyn had fallen asleep, I slipped out of our bedroom and crept up to the attic. I had to know what Blackwood Orphanage had hidden. It had been bothering me since we'd brought Alice home. That orphanage that no one seemed to want to talk about. People around town didn't speak its name in the daylight, let alone the night. There were whispers, sure, but no one would tell me the whole story. So I decided to dig into the records myself. The attic was cold, damp with the scent of dust and mildew. The old trunks and boxes were stacked up in the corners, forgotten relics of a time that had passed. I flipped on the light, a single dim bulb hanging from the rafters, its feeble glow barely enough to see by. I pulled the creaky door open, its hinges groaning like a distant warning. I had been up there once before, but only for a quick look around. I never thought to look closely at the boxes marked with faded labels like family history or personal belongings. That night I decided I wouldn't make the same mistake. I rummaged through the papers, each one more brittle than the last, until I found the box marked Blackwood Orphanage. My heart started to pound as I pried it open. The first thing I saw was a stack of adoption papers, each one with the same name written at the top, Alice. There were dozens of them, each adoption dated with different years, stretching back over a century. And there, near the bottom, was a photo, a blurry, faded portrait of the orphanage's matron. She was, standing with her arms around a little girl, a child with porcelain-pale skin and dark, lifeless eyes. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same haunting smile, the same unblinking stare, the same child. But how I flipped through the pages feverishly, my fingers trembling as I read the entries, each one more chilling than the last. There were stories of families that had adopted children from Blackwood and had been changed, drained, hollowed out in ways that couldn't be explained. Women who had miscarried multiple times, who were inexplicably swollen with pregnancy only to give birth to stillborn creatures. Men who had lost themselves, their bodies wasting away, their minds broken. It was as if someone, had taken pieces of them. And then I found it, the final entry. It sent ice through my veins. It was a letter, dated 1892, from the orphanage's matron to a family that had been seeking a child for adoption. The letter spoke of the unique nature of Blackwood's children, emphasizing how special they were, how they could fill the emptiness in a home. The last line caught me, though. It was a line that made my blood run cold. Some children aren't born, they're borrowed. I felt as though the floor had shifted beneath me. It made no sense, but at that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. Alice wasn't just an orphan. She was part of something darker, something ancient. She had been passed from family to family, feeding off their grief, their desperation. I couldn't explain it, but it didn't matter anymore. I had to stop it. Whatever Alice was, whatever she had promised my wife, it was not something we could control. It was something that had control over us. The floor creaked behind me and I spun around. There, standing in the doorway of the attic, was Alice. Her pale face was as expressionless as ever, but her eyes were different. They were no longer dark, like a child's eyes. They were cold, empty, hollow, like the void. And then she spoke, her voice as smooth as silk, but filled with something sinister. "You know, don't you?" she asked, her head tilting slightly to the side. I couldn't move. My throat felt tight, my body frozen in place. "Evelyn can't have them back," Alice continued, her voice low, almost sympathetic. "Not the way you think." I took a step back, my pulse thudding in my ears. "What do you want from us?" I demanded. "Why are you doing this?" Alice's smile widened, an unsettling, knowing smile. "I don't want anything, Daniel. I'm just here to help her." She asked for them. She asked for them back. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The room felt smaller, suffocating. My mind raced, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a way out. "Evelyn's not the one you should be worried about," Alice said softly. "It's you. You're the one who's keeping her from what she wants. You're the one who's holding her back, and that's why you'll have to go first." I didn't understand what she meant, but I didn't have to. The moment she finished speaking, the attic door slammed shut behind her, and the air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. I was trapped, and I had no idea how much time we had left before it was too late. The feeling of being trapped didn't fully settle in until I heard the nursery door slam behind me. Alice was gone now, vanished like a shadow slipping through a crack in the night. But her words echoed in my head, hollow and chilling. I couldn't make sense of them. Not yet. All I could feel was the weight of what she had said. The thing that was growing inside Evelyn. The thing that wasn't just a child. The more I tried to push the thought away, the more the image of Evelyn's swollen belly invaded my mind. The ultrasound. The shadows, moving, shifting beneath her skin. It was as though something else was there. Something that wasn't supposed to be. I couldn't bear it any longer. I had to talk to Evelyn. I had to get through to her. I rushed downstairs, barely remembering the steps as I rushed through the dark hallways of the farmhouse. Each creak, of the wooden floor beneath my feet, sending a wave of anxiety through me. When I reached the nursery door, I stopped. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. For a long moment, I just stood there, my hand on the doorknob, feeling the warmth of the house that had once felt so comforting, now suffocating. Finally, I turned the knob and opened the door. Evelyn was sitting in the rocking chair, her eyes wide and distant, staring at the crib. She wasn't holding her stomach like she had been before. No, now she was just still, motionless. Her face was pale, drained. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days. Her hair, once neatly brushed, now hung in unkempt tangles around her face and Alice. She was standing in the corner, watching. She didn't move as I entered, didn't look at me. She just stood there, still as stone, her dark eyes locked onto Evelyn. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words died in my throat. There was a heaviness in the air, a presence I couldn't name, like the room had been hollowed out and something had taken its place. Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was thin, distant. "Daniel, they're here." I froze. My heart pounded against my ribs as I tried to comprehend what she was saying. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. I moved toward her slowly, cautiously, like approaching a wounded animal. But Evelyn didn't seem to hear me. She was looking at the crib, her gaze fixed as though she was waiting for something. "They're coming," she repeated, her words soft, almost tender. "All of them. Alice said I can have them back, Daniel. I can have my babies back." I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. I reached out for her hand, but she pulled it away, cradling it against her chest as if shielding something invisible. "Evelyn," I started, but my voice faltered. "Please, you're not well. This isn't real." "Alice. She's not who you think she is. She's not a child, Evelyn. She's something else. Something we can't control." Evelyn's eyes flickered toward me for the first time, but there was nothing in them. No recognition, just that same hollow emptiness. "She promised," she whispered. "She promised I could have them back." The crib rattled, the sound so sudden, so violent that it felt like the whole room was trembling. My heart skipped in my chest and I turned toward it. The crib shook again, louder this time, and then a dark shape moved inside it. I stepped back, in shock, my breath coming in short gasps. Something was wrong. The shadows beneath the sheets were shifting, coiling like snakes, and then I saw it, the form inside the crib. It wasn't a baby, not anymore. It was something darker, something twisted. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face was obscured by shadow, but I could see the glint of teeth in the dim light. Evelyn stood up slowly, a strange, unearthly calm taking over her features as she moved toward the crib. She reached out with trembling hands, her face softening. "My children," she murmured, as though she were in a trance. I felt a rising panic. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I grabbed her wrist, pulling her away from the crib. "Evelyn, stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "This isn't our baby. This isn't our child." But Evelyn didn't respond. She turned to face me, her eyes now filled with something worse than emptiness, something that could only be described as hunger. Her mouth curled into a twisted smile. "They're mine, Daniel," she said, her voice low and almost satisfied. "They've always been mine." I stumbled back, unable to speak, my throat tight with fear. My gaze flicked to Alice, who was still standing in the corner of the room, watching with those dark, unblinking eyes. The figure in the crib stirred again. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in me screamed to run. The thing inside the crib slowly rose up, its skin stretching, its arms snapping into place like they didn't belong. A low, gurgling noise escaped its throat. And then, in an instant, it was standing in front of me. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was as though time had stopped. The thing that had once been a child reached out toward me with gnarled fingers, and I saw its face, a grotesque mockery of innocence. Its eyes were pitch black, No whites, no pupils, just endless voids. Alice's voice cut through the silence, soft and melodic. "It's too late, Daniel," she whispered. "She's already chosen." The room felt like it was closing in on me. I turned toward the door, but Evelyn was in front of it now, blocking my escape, her movements slow, deliberate. I didn't know how much time passed before the world went dark. All I knew was the feeling of cold fingers curling around my throat, pulling me into something that would never let me go. The last thing I heard before the world swallowed me whole was Evelyn's voice, soft and distant. "I'll never let them go again." And then, nothing. The soil outside the farmhouse would breathe once more. The sheriff arrived the following morning, just as the sun began to rise over the distant hills, casting pale golden light over the abandoned farmhouse. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves clung to the air, thickening with each step he took toward the door. His boots crunched the frost-covered ground, his breath rising in puffs of white, as if the morning itself were reluctant to accept the events that had unfolded. He was a tall man, weathered by years of service, his face lined with the stories of too many dead bodies and too many nights spent chasing the shadows. But as he approached the house, there was a tightness in his posture, something different about this call. He had been out here before, investigating the occasional missing dog or the drunken brawl down at the general store. But this was something else. The house was eerily quiet. No sound of life, no hum of the furnace or the distant barking of a neighbor's dog. The silence settled over him, almost oppressive. He stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and knocked. His hand lingered on the door for a moment longer than usual, and he knocked again, louder this time. When there was no answer, he pushed the door open. The moment he stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It was like walking into a tomb, heavy, cold, filled with the scent of rot. The smell wasn't just mildew or the musty stench of old wood. It was something worse, something deeper, like death had settled into every corner of the house. His boots echoed through the empty halls as he moved cautiously toward the nursery. He paused outside the door, staring at the battered wood that stood between him and the answers he was certain lay behind it. There was a faint sound coming from the other side, something like a soft scraping, a gnawing noise. He pushed the door open. The room was a mess. The rocking chair was overturned. The crib tipped over onto its side. Toys were scattered across. The floor and the once pristine walls were now marred with strange, intricate symbols, etched deeply into the paint, glowing faintly in the dim light. A chill crawled down his spine as he looked at the crib where the mattress had been ripped open, its contents spilled across the floor. There were no babies, no children, only tattered sheets, and a mass of what appeared to be dirt. But it wasn't the dirt that made his stomach churn. It was the smell, the unmistakable coppery scent of blood mixed with something foul, something rotting, something that had never been human. As he stepped farther into the room, his flashlight swept over the walls, and that's when he saw it. A line of words, scratched into the wall in a jagged, frantic scrawl, as though someone had desperately tried to claw out a message. "Open the door." His pulse quickened, and he took a step back, his hand brushing the doorframe. That was when he noticed the nails. The door. The nursery door. It was nailed shut from the inside. "Jesus Christ," he whispered under his breath. He could feel the cold sweat prickling his skin, could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he turned toward the broken window. The fog outside was thick, swirling as if alive, wrapping around the trees like fingers, reaching, clawing, trying to pull him in. His radio crackled to life in his hand, and a voice came through, faint but clear. "Sheriff, you need to get out of there. We're getting reports from the neighbors. Strange sounds. Something's happening out there." But the sheriff didn't hear the rest. He was too focused on the movement in the corner of the room. A figure was standing there so still that he had almost missed it. A pale figure. Its eyes were black. No whites, no pupils. Just a void. It took him a moment to realize what he was seeing. It was Alice. She was no longer a little girl. She was something else now, something more. She looked at him with those unblinking eyes, and for the first time the sheriff felt true fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from a gunfight or a drunken brawl. This was deeper, older, the kind of fear that speaks to something primal in your soul. She took a step toward him, then another. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as though she knew the effect she had on him. She reached out, her fingers stretching toward him like twisted branches reaching for prey. He backed away, his breath shallow, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his gun. But the moment he reached for it, she was upon him. Her hand, cold and lifeless, gripped his wrist, and in that instant he understood. She wasn't a child. She had never been a child. The sheriff didn't scream. He couldn't. There was no air in his lungs as the world around him twisted, as the ground beneath him seemed to crack open. Everything faded to black. When they found him, hours later, the house was silent once again. The door to the nursery remained nailed shut. The garden outside was overgrown, the roses long dead, and the soil, fresh and dark, seemed to pulse as though it was alive. The sheriff's body was found at the edge of the property, face down in the dirt. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. His hands were still clenched tight around the radio as if he had tried to call for help. But there was no help. There was only the house. There was only Alice. And in the distance, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a single fresh grave could be seen in the garden, a child's grave. But when you looked closer, you could hear the soil shift. And if you listened, the earth seemed to whisper, "Some children aren't born. They're borrowed." And as the wind carried the words away, you could almost hear the faintest, softest hum, a lullaby, cold and haunting, lingering in the air. The hollow child was never truly gone, not entirely. I never expected to inherit a house, let alone one as strange as Dr. Elias Werner's. When my grandfather passed away in 1987, his disappearance had made waves, mostly in scientific circles. He was a physicist, and a brilliant one at that, but something about his research had always been off. It was the kind of thing people whispered about in dark corners, the kind of thing that got him labeled a madman. I was only 6 when he vanished, but I'd heard the stories. My mother rarely spoke about him, and when she did, it was always with a certain hesitancy, like she feared something might still be out there waiting for her. Fast forward 30 years. My mother passed away unexpectedly last year, and I was left with nothing but a small inheritance and an old decaying house on the outskirts of town. I had no real connection to the place, but the title was mine, for whatever it was worth. I wasn't sure what to do with it. Most of the neighborhood was abandoned, and the house itself had always been a source of mystery and discomfort for me. It was crumbling, overtaken by ivy and decay, a ghost of the brilliant man who had lived there. But I'm a documentary filmmaker, always looking for a good story, and the thought of this house, this strange house that had been locked up for decades, seemed too perfect to ignore. There had to be something interesting here, some hidden treasure, a secret that my grandfather had left behind. Maybe this was the documentary I'd been waiting for. So I packed my bags, grabbed my camera, and made the trip to the house. When I arrived, I was struck by how much the place had deteriorated. The windows were boarded up, the once grand front porch sagging with age. The garden, once meticulously cared for, was now a tangle of overgrown weeds and vines. I unlocked the front door, the ancient key fitting with a satisfying click. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew and decay heavy in the silence. I spent the first few hours walking through the house, taking footage of everything. The moldy wallpaper peeling away from the walls, the creaky wooden floors, the grand staircase that led to the second floor. Everything felt forgotten, like time had stood still. As I wandered through the rooms, I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me, the echoes of my grandfather's footsteps long gone but still somehow lingering. It wasn't until I made my way up to the attic that things took a more unsettling turn. The attic was a mess, piles of old furniture, broken down boxes, and discarded papers. But in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs, was a large, locked steamer trunk. The lock was rusted, but the brass hinges still gleamed, faintly in the dim light. It felt out of place, almost purposeful. I took a deep breath, grabbed a crowbar from one of the piles, and pried the lid open. Inside, I found a stack of old VHS tapes, carefully labeled in my grandfather's precise handwriting. At first glance, they seemed like nothing more than memories, birthdays, holidays, the typical family moments caught on tape. But as I dug deeper into the trunk, something about the arrangement of the tapes caught my eye. Beneath them was a weathered journal, its leather cover cracked and fragile. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected this. A glimpse into the mind of the man who had once been a giant in his field. The thought that I might finally understand the secrets of Dr. Elias Werner made me dizzy with excitement. I pulled the journal from the trunk, dusting it off carefully before flipping it open. The pages were filled with my grandfather's meticulous handwriting. But as I skimmed through the entries, I began to feel a growing unease. The entries were bizarre, disjointed. It was clear he had been studying something beyond the physical world, something otherworldly. I reached for the first VHS tape in the stack and slipped it into the old player. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage of a Christmas celebration. My family, my parents, me, a child, grinning in front of a Christmas tree. But there was something off. In the background, almost hidden in the shadows, stood a figure, tall, blurred, with its face a mass of static. I paused the tape, heart hammering. Was that a camera defect? It didn't seem possible. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. But when I continued to play through the tapes, it became clear that the figure was always there, lingering just out of focus. With each new tape, it was closer, closer to the frame, closer to the family, closer to me. This wasn't a defect. Something was wrong. The next morning, I sat in the attic, the dim light of the single bulb overhead casting long shadows across the cluttered space. The stack of VHS tapes lay in front of me, and the journal was open beside them. I had watched a few more tapes last night, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me as I stared at the blurry figure in the background of each frame. I had to understand what it was. I needed to make sense of it before I could continue with the documentary. I picked up the journal, flipping through the pages slowly, trying to make sense of the scattered entries. Dr. Werner's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the pages went on, the once perfect script starting to bleed into jagged, almost frantic scrawl. I found it hard to read in places, words scratched out, hastily written sentences, almost as if he had been trying to get something down before it slipped away from him. The first few pages spoke of his early research, the work he had done in quantum physics, his theories on the nature of reality, the multiverse, and the collapse of observation. These were things I had studied in school, concepts I understood. But as I moved deeper into the journal, the focus shifted, the language changed, and so did the tone. It became darker, almost desperate. Subject is aware of observation. One entry read, "It feeds on attention. Do not watch past 3 a.m. I paused, staring at the words. What was he talking about? Who was the subject? Was it the figure on the tapes? It sounded absurd even to me, but there was an urgency in his writing that made it hard to dismiss. The next entry was even more unsettling. Recording fails every time. It sees me. It knows I'm looking. The presence, it is not of this world. It sees through the lens, through the screen. I'm being watched. It waits. It watches me. Watches us. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I read his words. There was something incredibly personal about it. I had always known that my grandfather had been a brilliant mind, but this was madness. Was it the stress of his research that had driven him to this state? Or had he uncovered something he wasn't supposed to? I looked at the clock on the wall, noting that it was well past noon now. I hadn't expected to spend so much time in the attic, but I couldn't seem to tear myself away from the journal. The deeper I went, the more drawn I was to the mystery that surrounded my grandfather's disappearance. There was another entry that stood out. Tonight, I made a grave mistake. The figure in the background, the watcher, it's moving closer. It's not a distortion, it's real. Every time I press play, it watches me more closely. Every frame brings it nearer. And then the last word was smeared like he had gotten frustrated or perhaps frightened and scratched it out. The rest of the page was filled with frantic symbols, drawings that looked like they were from a child's notebook. Circles, lines, spirals. It was the kind of thing that made no sense unless you had seen it before. And the more I looked at it, the more I felt like I was starting to lose my own sense of clarity. What had happened to my grandfather? What was he trying to warn me about? I put the journal down and decided to watch another tape. The earlier tapes had shown nothing more than blurry figures standing in the background of family moments. But now I needed answers. I needed to know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or if there was something real, something sinister happening. I grabbed the second-to-last tape in the stack and slipped it into the player. The screen flickered, and the static buzzed for a few seconds before it settled. The tape showed my parents and me at another family gathering. But this time, the figure in the background was clearer. It wasn't as blurred as before. It was tall, its outline just barely visible, but unmistakable. The figure's posture was wrong, too rigid, too unnatural. Its arms hung limply by its sides and its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if studying the family through some unseen lens. I froze. My throat tightened and my pulse quickened. The figure wasn't just in the background. It was closer. It was standing just beyond the frame of the shot, peering over my father's shoulder, its face still a smudge of static, but its presence undeniable. I tried to pause the tape, but the player wouldn't cooperate. The picture skipped, the static, distorting the image more and more as the figure drew nearer, moving, inching closer with each passing second. I hit the stop button, but the image didn't freeze. It kept going, the figure advancing faster now. My heart was hammering in my chest. I reached for the remote again, desperate to end the video, but the screen flashed a final disturbing image before it went black. The figure was right there. It was in the frame, standing next to me, its hollow eyes locked onto the camera. It wasn't static anymore. It was real, and I was staring right at it. I couldn't breathe. My stomach twisted in knots. I couldn't look away. I had to get up, get out, do something, anything, but my body wouldn't obey. And then, as the screen remained black, I heard it, a sound, a voice. But it wasn't my grandfather's voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was something wrong, like a chorus of whispers layered over one another, distorted. The words were garbled, but I could make out one thing clearly. You've seen it now. It sees you. Welcome to the experiment. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The TV turned off on its own, and the silence that followed felt deafening. I grabbed the journal again, my hands shaking. The last few entries were burned into my mind now. The warning, the figure, the mention of attention. I had been watching. The tape's all wrong. I wasn't just documenting a story anymore, I had become part of it. My grandfather knew what he was doing. He was trying to stop it. But it was too late for me, just like it had been too late for him. I was sitting in the, dark. The journal spread out before me, the tape scattered in disarray across the desk, but none of it mattered. The world had shifted around me, and I was struggling to keep my footing. The whispers I had heard from the static were still ringing in my ears. I didn't want to admit it, but deep down, I knew. The thing on those tapes wasn't just a trick of the camera. It wasn't a distortion or some glitch caused by faulty equipment. It was something else entirely. Something that had been watching, waiting for a long time. The words from the last journal entry, "Welcome to the experiment," kept echoing in my head. It sounded absurd, like something out of a bad horror movie. But I knew now that whatever was happening, whatever had happened to my grandfather, it was real. I could feel it deep in my bones. It was well after midnight when the phone rang. The shrill sound of the old rotary phone on the wall startled me. I had forgotten it even worked. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't even noticed the time passing. My eyes were heavy, but I had been so focused on the journal, on the tapes, that I had lost track of everything. I jumped out of my chair, a sense of unease creeping over me as I grabbed the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice tentative. The line crackled for a moment, and then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a voice, but it wasn't quite right. It was distorted, layered, as if several voices were speaking at once, all blending together in a chorus of whispers. "You've seen it now," the voice said, its tone eerie and unsettling. "It sees you. Welcome to the experiment." I froze. I had heard these words before, on the tapes. But this time the voice wasn't coming from the static. It was coming from the other end of the phone, as clear as day. "Grandfather?" I whispered, my throat tight. But the voice that responded wasn't Elias Werner's. It wasn't even a single voice. It was a chorus, a cacophony of different tones, overlapping, each one more distorted than the last. The sounds warped and bent as if the words were coming from somewhere beyond the limits of our reality. "You are the subject now. The experiment never ends." The phone line went dead. I stood there staring at the receiver in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. My heart was pounding in my chest. My breath felt shallow, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I had known, on some level, that things had gone too far. But now it was undeniable. My grandfather hadn't just been researching something. He had been involved in something much darker, something that reached beyond the realm of science and into the very fabric of reality itself. I dropped the phone back onto the receiver and turned toward the TV. It was still off, the screen dark and empty. But I knew that wasn't going to last. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had uncovered had only scratched the surface of something much worse. I grabbed the remote and turned the television on. The static buzzed to life almost immediately, the screen flickering for a moment before settling into a distorted, pixelated image. But there was something wrong, something different. It wasn't the usual fuzziness of old worn tapes. The static on the screen wasn't just a visual malfunction. It was alive, like it was breathing, shifting, pulsing. I could feel the presence of something behind the screen, something that was watching me in return. The figure appeared, just like before. Only this time it wasn't blurred or distant. It was right there, filling the frame. Its face was still a mass of static, but its form was clearer than ever. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to absorb everything around them. Its body stretched unnaturally, the limbs too long, too thin, like a shadow cast in wrong proportions. I stepped back, a cold sweat forming on my brow. My mind raced. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. The figure on the screen moved. It tilted its head, its eyes, or whatever they were, locking onto me. It was aware of me. It was aware that I was watching. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then in the silence of my apartment, I heard it again. A whisper. "It sees you." The static on the screen distorted again, as if the figure was reaching toward me, through the TV, into my world. I felt the temperature drop in the room, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into my skin. I stumbled backward, my hand finding the chair to steady myself. My heart was racing and my thoughts were a whirlwind. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave this house, this place that had become a trap. But my feet wouldn't move. The static, the whispers, they were all consuming me. I couldn't escape it. I glanced over at the clock on the wall. It was 3:07 a.m. I had been watching the tapes for hours, but it was like time had lost all meaning. The moment the clock's minute hand clicked into place, something shifted. The television screen flickered again, and then the figure on the screen spoke. "You are the experiment now." Welcome to the tape. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I rushed to the television, grabbed the remote and hit the off button, but the screen stayed on. The static moved, swirling like a vortex sucking me in. I turned and ran, but as I moved toward the door, the walls around me seemed to close in. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was bending around me, warping. It was like the world itself had become part of the tape, part of the experiment. I reached for the door handle, my fingers cold and numb, but I couldn't open it. The door was locked from the inside. I turned to look at the television one last time, and when I did, I saw it. The figure was no longer on the screen. It was standing in my room. It smiled. The figure standing in my room wasn't just an image on a screen anymore. It was there. I could see it in the dim light, its silhouette cast against the wall like a dark stain, stretching and distorting as it moved. Its shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs bent at angles that weren't natural, like they were being controlled by some invisible force. The air felt charged, electric, and the temperature dropped sharply as if the room had just been drained of warmth. I froze, rooted to the spot. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. I couldn't look away, though I wanted nothing more than to run. The static on the screen in front of me continued to swirl and churn, the sound of the whispers filling the room again. But now it wasn't just in the static. It was real, and it was in the air around me, pressing in on me like a physical weight. The figure's face, if you could even call it that, was still just a smear of static, a shifting mass that couldn't be described. Its eyes, or the empty voids where eyes should be, locked onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Could feel it, deep in my bones, like the presence was burrowing into my mind, reading my every thought. The longer I stood there, the more it felt like it was becoming part of me, like the line between this thing and my own reality was becoming increasingly blurred. "You're part of it now," the voice whispered. That same distorted chorus of voices I'd heard on the phone now echoing inside my head. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as the words vibrated through me, chilling me to my core. I was shaking now, the fear creeping up on me in waves, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't just some bad dream or hallucination. This was happening. I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me, but I couldn't move fast enough. The figure shifted, its movements unnaturally fluid, and before I knew it, it was closer. It hadn't even moved. It just was closer. It was right. There, standing just a few feet away from me now, its presence filling the space between us like a vacuum. I could feel its gaze, cold and heavy, pressing into me. My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I don't understand," I finally managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond verbally, but the static on the television screen changed, fluctuating violently. The whispering grew louder, and the words that came through the static were now clearer, as if it was speaking directly to me. "You are the subject now. You were always the subject. The tape never ends, Daniel. The experiment. You are part of the experiment now." The last part of the sentence seemed to echo, reverberating in my mind, distorting and twisting as if the words were being pulled apart by the very air around me. I could feel the walls closing in, the floor beneath me becoming unstable, like everything was folding in on itself. The figure stood motionless, yet I felt like it was pulling at me, drawing me into the very core of the static. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me. The whispers filled every corner of the space, but now they were inside me, in my head, louder, more persistent. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape it. The lines between the room, the television, and my own mind were disappearing. It was all merging into one. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. Suddenly, the static from the television spiked. A sharp, high-pitched noise echoed through the room, louder than anything I had ever heard. and for a brief moment I felt like my body was about to implode. The air seemed to thicken, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the desk. The papers and tapes scattered across the floor in a chaotic mess. The figure moved again, but this time it wasn't just the figure in front of me. It was everywhere. I could see it on the walls, in the reflection of the monitor, in the shadows beneath the door. It was in my thoughts now. It was inside me, crawling into the depths of my mind like a parasite, feeding off my fear, feeding off the attention I had given it. I reached for the television remote, my fingers trembling as I fumbled for it. I had to turn it off. I had to break this connection before it was too late. With one desperate motion, I pressed the off button, but the television stayed on. The static continued to swirl. The figure didn't disappear. The whispers were growing, louder. I could hear my name being called over and over again, distorted, twisted, like it wasn't even me they were calling for. I looked back at the television screen, and this time, the figure's face was no longer just a blur. It had taken shape. I could see its features, hollow eyes, a gaping mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, its face splitting the static in a grotesque way. My hand shook uncontrollably, and I tried to reach for the remote again, but it felt as though my arm was getting heavier, as though the static was pulling me in, slowing me down. My fingers began to pixelate, the edges of my body blurring, warping like the image on the screen. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My body was falling apart, disintegrating, just like the screen was cracking, warping, tearing, apart at the edges. The last thing I saw before the static swallowed me whole was the figure on the screen, its grin widening impossibly wide, stretching across its face as if it were mocking me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I understood. The experiment was never about my grandfather. It was always about me. I had become the subject. I was the tape now. The first thing I noticed when the static subsided was the suffocating silence. It was no longer the disorienting, chaotic buzzing that had filled my ears, just stillness, a thick, oppressive void that seemed to press in on me. But I was aware, painfully aware of every inch of my body, every movement, every sound. The sensation of weightlessness lingered around me, as if gravity itself had loosened its grip. I wasn't sure if I was still in the same room. Everything around me seemed off, dim and unrecognizable. The walls felt as though they were made of paper, distorting with every blink of my eyes. The air tasted stale, stagnant, as if I had been holding my breath for far too long. I tried to move, to stand up, but something was wrong. My legs weren't responding the way they should. My body felt alien, like it wasn't quite mine anymore. When I looked down, I saw my hands. The edges of them were shifting. I watched in horror as the skin seemed to pixelate, to break apart and reassemble itself in jagged patterns. It wasn't my hands anymore. They were distorted, becoming part of the static, part of the blur, disintegrating before my very eyes. I gasped, trying to control my breathing, but it only made the sensation worse. I felt like I was being pulled apart from the inside. I couldn't even feel the floor beneath me. The world was fading in and out like a broken signal, flickering in and out of focus. Then it hit me. I wasn't in the room anymore. I wasn't even in my own body. The realization came to me slowly, like a nightmare seeping into reality. I was inside the tape. Everything I had watched, every moment I had tried to understand, it had all been leading to this. I was no longer the observer. I was the observed. The whispering started again, but this time it wasn't just in my head. It filled every inch of space around me. The chorus of voices echoed through my mind, louder now but distorted. I couldn't understand the words. They weren't just speaking. They were devouring me. Each syllable sliced through me, pulling me deeper into the digital void. You are the tape now. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The sound of my own voice felt distant, like it was coming from someone else. The words I was saying didn't sound like mine. I didn't recognize myself. I didn't feel like myself anymore. I tried to move, again to fight it. I had to get out. There had to be a way out. But as I pushed myself to stand, the world around me collapsed further, the walls bending and twisting in on themselves. It was no longer a room, no longer a house. It was a digital void, endless static, broken and fractured, folding into itself in impossible ways. I was no longer a person. I was part of the chaos, part of the signal. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figure, the watcher, its grin splitting the screen, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It was no longer just an image. It was a part of me wrapped around my mind, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into the tape. I had become it, the figure, the watcher, the experiment. I had crossed the line between observer and subject, and there was no going back. The next time I became aware of anything, it was like waking up from a long, dark sleep. My senses returned, but they were different. I wasn't in a room anymore. There were no walls, no floor, no ceiling, just the unending stretch of static, a white noise that consumed everything, suffocating the space between me and reality. Didn't feel human anymore. I didn't feel like anything. I reached out, or at least I tried to. My hands, my body, seemed to float in the emptiness. But the more I concentrated, the more I realized my hands weren't mine anymore. They were still pixelated, still disintegrating at the edges. I was no longer a person. I was part of the tape. I was part of the experiment, just like my grandfather had been. I tried to scream, but it wasn't my voice that came out. It was the chorus. The hundreds of voices layered on top of one another, distorting, blending, and merging until they sounded like one thing, the watcher. And when I realized it, truly realized it, I understood that there was no escape. This was my reality now. I was in the tape the same way my grandfather had been. His disappearance, the madness in his journal. It was all connected. It wasn't a failed experiment. It was the only outcome. I was a part of it. The tape had consumed me, just as it had consumed him. I had been watched for so long, and now I was part of the very thing I had sought to uncover. The static continued to swallow me whole. There was no room for anything else, no escape. And then, as everything began to collapse into the endless digital void, I understood one last thing. Some experiments never end.